There's all the bodies for
Oh,
Spartacus.
for Spartacus.
Yeah, they got all the numbers.
You will be body 36.
Yeah, that's
This is
right,
how
yeah.
Having played a dead guy extra in many films in Hong Kong, I completely
Oh.
appreciate that Kubrick actually took the time to give people direction.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Divulgence. Very, very excited today. I have a very special returning guest. We have the Fringe of the Fringe back. He is a author, co-author of books on some very interesting topics, including the Saturn theory, the electric universe theory. We've had him on before, and I'm very happy to bring him back. Please help me welcome Troy McLachlan. Troy, how are you, my friend?
Hey, Jordan. Hey, it's great to be back, and thanks for inviting me back on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming back. I'm excited for our conversation today. And I think it sounds like maybe we might have to hook up a couple times over the next little while to try to sprawl everything out on the table to dissect it properly. So thank you again for coming.
My pleasure.
I've enjoyed, I think maybe Clockwork Orange was the first movie of his I had seen, and I loved it right away. I was pretty young, so I wasn't into film and studying film per se. I didn't know directors' names or anything like that, but I just knew that, wow, this movie is different.
Yeah.
I like it. It makes me think. And then over time, I started to, watch other movies of his, and just honestly, quite very recently, I learned what the meaning of Eyes Wide Shut was from my friend Sean McCann, who I've met recently. He's done some great research on that, and he opened my eyes wide open on that. And like I told you when we were chatting before this, I honestly thought the movie was garbage. I thought it was boring. I was not so much confused, but just I couldn't catch on to things. I couldn't get into it. But as soon as I learned what was going on, what it's really about, what I really need to be paying attention to, it's a whole new movie. It's a whole new movie. It's unbelievable. And I find with The Shining too. The Shining, I've become a huge Shining fan over the last little while. So much as like I'm going to get a copy of the book, because I think when it comes to decoding The Shining, I think we got to find as many clues that are left on the earth that he left us to find. And I think a lot of the clues are in the book, because a lot of stuff happens in the movie that can easily be explained in the book. But if you're not paying attention, you don't know what's going on. Like the guy with the cut down his face who scares Wendy. And I think he said, a hell of a party or whatever. It turns out he's actually I think he's the owner of the Overlook. And so there's so much. And that's why the archive book is really great too, because it has the 3 Polaroids from the deleted scene at the end of The Shining, which is really interesting. And then it has a couple pictures from a scene that was cut out of Eyes Wide Shut.
So when you say Polaroids, are you talking about continuity Polaroids?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's unbelievable. And that's why it's whether he was, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm giving him more credit than, he deserves all the credit, but maybe I'm just giving him more in a certain area than is due. But I don't know if he knows what he was leaving behind to full extent, but it's he's got us like rats in a maze sometimes, and in a good way though.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll show you that real quick.
Okay, these are the Polaroids.
Yeah, so there's Wendy in the hospital bed. There's Mr. Ullman visiting them.
Yeah.
And then there's Danny with one of the nurses.
Right.
So he comes in essentially, hey, just checking in on you guys.
Yeah.
He says that no one was found at the Overlook, meaning Jack wasn't found. And I think Hallerman, who was killed, apparently he wasn't found. So maybe that means he was absorbed into the evilness of The Shining, of the Overlook. And then he throws Danny the ball.
Right.
Which, it just starts up a whole other thing, because the ball comes up in so many areas of the movie. So essentially he cut it out just because it was he's pulling too many rugs from under you at once at the end of the movie. So that's why it was decided to be cut. Actually, I think it was the second day of the premiere, the day after the premiere. So he actually had people running around LA and New York in the theaters cutting and man. So they're like, okay, what reel are we on? Do we have time to cut this before the next reel? So it's just unbelievable stories like that you know, go into like the Howard Hughes story, or you know, just things that only would happen in the life of a genius, right? So but back to what you were talking about with Jay
Widener.
So I am very familiar with Room 237. I've watched Jay Widener's documentary video. I think he's supposed to have 2, but I don't think he ended up making the second one. Is that correct? I think
I can't find it anywhere. And I wondered if it happened or not.
Okay, so Kubrick's Odyssey, is that him?
Yes.
I think so, right? So he did. I think there's supposed to be a Kubrick's Odyssey 2, which there isn't. And then he talks about Kubrick the Magician,
right,
which also never happened. And I've seen people comment saying he didn't do this never happened. So I know that. So that's kind of all I really know.
I personally met with Jay Widener about 8 years ago in London, and he was saying even then he had stuff ready to go. In his words, they were going to blow the lid on everything Kubrick and such. But he did say that he was getting pushback from the family legally.
The Kubrick family.
And so, because I think that's why he was in London at the time to follow up on a lot of that sort of stuff with the Kubrick's being just, living out in Hertfordshire, past whatever. So I was never sure where it left. I was highly impressed with his filmmaker's take on what was happening with the special effects in 2001.
Projection?
Yeah, as a way of possibly how they faked the moon, the Apollo 11 landings and so on like that. But I was also highly impressed with the Widener in that he saw Kubrick as an alchemist, but with the chosen film being his form of alchemy. And that always impressed me from it, because being somebody who's worked in the film industry and had pretensions in that area, and that it's always good to hear stories that are past the, hey, I'm going to work with some good looking actresses and put together a film that everybody wants to see and thinks I'm great. Kubrick was a different. It was the first time I heard about
of Kubrick.
Precisely. Not interested in that sort of director celebrity type of role that many directors end up, falling for.
Exactly. Yep. So that's why I think when it comes to the alchemy stuff that you mentioned, I think that is like a good core. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that might be a good core of what Kubrick the Magician was supposed to play on. So that's why I was pretty excited for that, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So that I guess that kind of explains it. Maybe essentially maybe he simply just is sitting on it now, and he just can't or won't move on it right now.
I think he backed off on it. Jay got some investment in starting up a TV channel of his own, and that's what I was interviewed. I did a segment on my book for it back then. I've never really followed up on it, but Widener was genuinely an influence on me for writing Saturn Death Cult.
Oh, nice.
On what he was saying about Kubrick, and that's where it all comes in. Yeah.
Okay. He's on my list of people I'd like to reach out to just to see if, he'd talk to me. So maybe the three of us can, if I can get a hold of him and he'd agree to come on, maybe, the three of us can have a chat. So.
Yeah, no, I'm always open. Jay's a good guy.
Okay. I'll put that, I'll bump that closer to the top of my list of to-dos then.
He's literally also the only guy in what you would call the alternative research world that I personally had anything to do with.
I've had him on my show many times, and he runs a great podcast. Have you heard of William Ramsey?
No, I haven't. No,
okay.
That's one name I know.
Okay. I'll send you his podcast for you to take a look at, because he does just great stuff. And actually, you might want to reach out to him about going on his show, because he essentially does a lot of books and authors, and the way he does it is really good. And it's a popular show for a good reason. So I'll send you that just to see if you're interested. But I'd like to even get the three of us with him together. I like to do that when I meet people like yourself or William that I like talking to and I think are on the right track and just have a lot to offer. I like bringing them together. And we all got to to a certain extent, we're on the same side here, right? So we got to share and yeah, brainstorm. So that's interesting. So with Jay, he's got the documentary piece, and then he Room 237, and then he also has the documentary piece of his own. Is there anything else Kubrick wise that you've seen of his that's worth checking out?
Of Jay's?
Yeah.
No, I mean it's really
meat and potatoes of it, right?
The meat and potatoes of it is it's just simply that Jay, being an alchemist, is highly interested in symbolism, and Kubrick is probably the most prolific user of symbolism in film.
Sure.
Of
I would agree.
Of all the guys, and that's the connection, really.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, yeah, I'll reach out to him and see if maybe the three of us can get together sometime. That'd be great. But yeah, just to speak to your point, yeah, I mean, I've heard his stuff, and I don't think he has anything else. Yeah. What is your overall thought on? I know The Shining isn't the main topic by any means of today, but what is your thought on Room 237 as a piece on its own?
To do with The Shining?
Yeah, like what's your thought on? I mean, I know it's individual people with their individual theories, so it's not like
Well, once again, I was never a horror movie fan, except
me neither.
Genre, sort of interested me sometimes. But I came late to The Shining. Terrified me as a kid when I saw the adverts, for the trailers on TV.
Okay.
The kid, because in the trailers they show the young boy running sort of aimlessly through a snow-covered maze.
That's a freaky shot.
Yeah, all that sort of from above, which before the advent of what do you call these things, drones and things like that, getting shots like that was one hell of a task. And
that's something I don't think of.
Yeah, that's just Kubrick pulling that off with the kid, just giving that sense that you're looking over his shoulder like some malevolent entity following him down the line. That terrified me when I was a kid. It was The Shining and The Exorcist were the two movies that really scared the shit out of me as a kid. But going, in terms of The Shining, before I got to 2001, I was introduced to Jay Weidner over his take over The Shining.
Okay.
In which his take on that is that it's almost a confession on the part of Kubrick of his role in the Apollo cover-ups and the moon landings, that sort of thing. And again, this sort of idea of what Eisenhower had warned us against, the industrial military complex becoming the driving force in manipulating Western society. So I looked at it from that point of view, and I could see where he was going. And I could also see where Kubrick had purposefully, and he did this in most of his films, as we'll probably discuss that, he based films on existing stories, as if he found it difficult to write stories, but once he had a story outline, off he went to the races with relationships and symbols. And so it seems that he has this, problematic relationship, doesn't he, with all these authors, from Arthur C. Clarke to Stephen King, who, are, they are horrified by what he does with their work.
I'm horrified. Sorry to interrupt. I'm horrified with the Stephen King version per se of The Shining. Have you seen that?
No.
I'm horrified with
it?
His version. I think they made it into a TV series, a three-part. It might be a three-part series.
Yes, you're right.
Have you seen any of that?
Yeah.
No. It's awful. When I say I'm horrified, I'm saying that because it's so awful, Troy. It's ridiculous how bad it is, and to think that. Yeah, not that I want to be bashing on anyone, but it's just it's quite honestly garbage, and it's. And then I threw Dr. Sleep on last night because I was curious. I had never watched it. I kind of thought, it's, if Stephen King didn't like The Shining, what is this going to be? Is he going to try to impress Stephen King, or is he going to, tip his hat to Kubrick? And I think he was doing, I think he gave Kubrick a little tip of the hat. There was some. Have you seen Dr. Sleep?
I haven't, no.
Okay, so it's interesting, which reading online, some people just totally missed a lot of the, I guess you could say, Easter eggs. But there's a scene. I won't give any spoilers away, but there's a scene where Danny, as an adult, meets with a doctor or a priest or something, and his office is essentially Mr. Ullman's office, with the impossible window and the
Right.
eagle and the American flag on the desk. It's like a literal copy from everything to the chairs
of some kind.
Yeah, and he's even copied the angles and the shots from the scene, so he's almost mirrored the exact scene. For a second, I'm like, wait a minute, he's at the Overlook right now. What did I miss here? And then I looked it up, and it's like, oh, he's just he's just having fun with it. So just going back to what I said, he just leaves so much interesting stuff for us to play with, to think about. And I mean, like that carpet pattern, I mean, that alone, but I mean, a lot of the settings in The Shining are so interesting that, like, what filmmaker wouldn't want to try to recreate some of that stuff? But just to my point is that the Stephen King version is awful. It's awful.
Well, another aspect about Kubrick's films that is often overlooked is his use of music. That is, Spartacus won an award for it, I believe. The stuff he didn't have full control. But, the music that comes out of 2001 is, positively satanic at the end for a science fiction film.
Yeah.
And, The Shining, where he experimented with monotone synthesizers at a time, when very few people even understood synthesizers and such like that, phenomenal.
And the music for Eyes Wide Shut is just, I must not have been, when I first watched the movie and I said that when I thought it was garbage, I must not have even been able to pay attention to the music, that I thought it was so bad. Because when I put it on with open eyes, so to speak, and that waltz starts, it just took me away. Like it just, I was gone. I was into that movie until the end. And that music is just, it's just unbelievable. And then when he's confronted, and then the ding ding ding, or when he's being followed, Kubrick and music, unbelievable. Unbelievable, especially with Clockwork Orange. I mean, honestly, my search history is filled with a lot more classical music lately, because I'm like, I love the waltz song from Eyes Wide Shut, some of the Beethoven, I think, from Clockwork, some of the stuff from 2001. And I know that's now it's a lot of kind of generic mainstream classical stuff, but for me, it's quite foreign to me. So I'm loving it. And then there's the individual, not John Baxter, I forget, he's the writer, I forget, but he kind of came up with that camera. Now I'm forgetting it, but
they used Steadicam, one of the first productions.
Steadicam, thank you.
To use Steadicam and so
Garrett,
on.
I think his name was Garrett Brown, maybe. So essentially, it sounds like he was the inventor of it, so to speak. And The Shining and one other movie he said he was working on at the time. Those were seemed to be the first ones that had that technology, which is, I mean, there's so much in every movie or somewhere in the process of Kubrick's productions. There's all these inventions or
I think Kubrick
innovation.
I think Kubrick was only surpassed by David Lean for cinematography, innovations.
Okay.
In terms of what people in the industry know to be the progression of the language of film through cameras and the use of technology and so on. David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia is a industry standard amongst people in the field for pioneering incredible stuff that we all take for granted now. I think when I was growing up, it was always sort of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, Coppola's Godfather, and the Lawrence of Arabia epics. These were the sort of the greatest films of all time made, and Kubrick's 2001 was in there with it. These days, it's hard to overstate how much Kubrick was pioneering, even more so than Orson Welles. I'd give David Lean I'd give him the edge in terms of pioneering certain things that were just a absolute in the time. Nobody would allow that to happen in a film.
Okay.
I mean, the classic example is going from a dark scene straight to a blaring, noonday sun shot.
Okay.
Hey man,
sure.
You're gonna hurt the eyes of the audience. They're not gonna like it. They'll walk out.
Yeah.
Now we do that all the time.
We see it all the time. Yeah.
And that's what it was sort of known for, Lawrence of Arabia, more so than Citizen Kane or the latter Godfathers and so on like that. But Kubrick, I think, went beyond all of them in terms of symbolism, use of symbolism. And I think Kubrick was a man out of place. He eschewed Hollywood. I think 1961, he decided to go off and live in the UK, and he never returned. He was never part of that sort of Hollywood scene. And
he's considered, a lot of people just think he's a European or British filmmaker.
Yeah. And I think I've always believed that if it weren't for the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, that Hollywood would have been a backwater in terms of filmmaking, because the Russians were setting the standard prior to the First World War on how films, and even the guys who survived the revolution and all the purges that went with it and so on. The Russians were making films that were very evocative before Kubrick of what Kubrick would ultimately perfect in terms of the Western sort of appreciation for this type of filmmaking. But Russian cinematography, Russian use of film language was highly advanced in the years leading up to the revolution, and even after it, more so than Hollywood, that was geared purely to entertainment. And Kubrick was never an entertainment man. He was never a showman. He didn't make his film. He wasn't interested in whether you walked out feeling, wow, that was great, I felt like $1 million, I could dance up the street, which was the predominant role of Hollywood in making money in the Depression era and so on, where he grew up, the ends of that going through the Second World War. But it's my impression that without being a student, I've never been able to find anything where Kubrick looked at people like Eisenstein and these great Russian filmmakers or whatever, said they were an influence. I just think he thought the same way, but with the English language. And he explored ways to turn film into symbolism, because as Widener says, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a symbol's worth 1,000 pictures. And you're doing 24 frames a second. So you're clocking up 1,000 pictures pretty quickly in a film. But how do you make that memorable?
Exactly. Yeah.
Put something in there that triggers the subconscious. And this is all through Kubrick's films. And until it's pointed out to you, you're almost blind to it.
Exactly.
And such, but
yeah, man.
It's, and this is, Eyes Wide Shut is a
exactly
classic example of what was going on. Most people my age went off to see that because they thought they were going to get a full frontal from Nicole Kidman.
Yeah.
And, that was sort of the whole reason. And boy, what a disappointment the film was if tits and ass was what you were after.
Right. And going back to your point about a trailer, I've heard about trailers. I mean, I've kind of picked up, I was too young at the time to be interested in that, but I've picked up that the trailers, I'll have to look at them, but the trailers kind of give a false impression. They almost give you the impression that, we're gonna have some tits and ass. Because
they were cut by the studio after his death.
Exactly.
Exactly. The Eyes Wide Shut is a tragedy, because that legendary control that Kubrick exercised over every film he ever did except Spartacus, was subverted in the marketing of that film. And I believe a lot of stuff was recut and changed from the original. I don't know whether that's true, because no one's ever seen supposedly the director's cut that he took in. What was it, 3 or 4 days before he died?
Over my I think it's like give or take 5 days. I've seen 4, 5, and 6.
It's within a week,
less than a week. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I don't think we've ever seen that original cut that he supposedly was very nervous about.
Right.
Given his career, I mean, the guy who writes, he's got a site called Divulgence, and he goes looking at all kinds of everything from Monarch, MK Ultra control programs, things like that. He got interested in what was the meanings of a lot of Kubrick's films and Eyes Wide Shut. But it was actually his last words in his articles that really hit home as far as his take on it. And we know the film is a relationship between Kidman and Cruise's character, in terms of it's a very facile sort of relationship. And I'll just quote what he says in his last part of his essay on this guy from Vigilant Citizen. However, as Kubrick somehow communicates in the final scene, even if these two extremely self-absorbed, egotistical and superficial people, meaning the characters played by Cruise and Kidman, believe they've reached some kind of epiphany, what does it really change? And in other words, our civilization as a whole still has its eyes wide shut. And those were Kubrick's last cinematographic word. That's how he ends the play. I think that's well put, that a man who's, if you look at it, a man who seemed to use film to be trying to tell us stuff about the greater, larger spiritual decline of at least the West, you know, in terms of the world politic. These were his last cinematographic words, you know, that we're left, that we're still wondering with our eyes wide shut as to what is actually really going on in terms of the forces that manipulate us, want to manipulate us, exploit us, and so on. And it's a very sad sort of ending, because it sounds like Kubrick, you know, it sounds almost like there was a subconscious admission that he'd kind of failed in fully waking us all up to, you know, the different influences in our lives than what we all have. We're still obsessed with celebrity rather than the art that celebrity is used to market. You know, these are the problems that Kubrick faced all through his time in trying to get to us, and you know, that's how it ended for him. And of course, you know, the way that artificial intelligence, which he'd bought the rights of the book back in 1971, and apparently even by 1919, you know, computer generated graphics just had not actually reached the stage that he felt he needed to tell that story.
Right.
You know, Spielberg took it on and created a story that I feel, and a lot of people feel, subsumed Kubrick's main message. And that is, what part of our society would love to have a kid that remains 12 years their entire life? And, you know, this goes back to Lolita. This goes back to those, those themes that Kubrick was talking about. And in Eyes Wide Shut, you know, the imagery around what they call the slave kitten mentality, you know, this sort of sex kitten stuff that Barb sort of launched on the scene, you know, back in the 50s with her film, and became the emphasis of the sexually exploited child. Yeah.
Have you heard of
What's
this?
That one there?
Have you heard of this book?
Mind Control. Yes, I have. I've never bought it, but I do know the book. Yeah.
And then if you recognize what's going on here with the first cut over the first frame of Eyes Wide Shut. So yeah, sorry, just giving your point a little.
Well, I think Kubrick was on a mission.
Yeah.
You know, tell us about this. He was a classic example of a man who was part of the machinery, but tried to subvert the machinery by going beyond. You know, in other words, you know, he used the superior intellect to defeat those who are trying to dumb us down to the most common denominator that they can for us. And, you know, I think he died a man who, you know, probably felt he had not actually achieved in his lifetime. And it's impossible for somebody like that to know how his films as a legacy will continue to live on.
Right.
I do know people disparage anybody saying that Kubrick had these ulterior motives for making films, that he was just simply making films and so on. But I'm of the impression that one or two films you could maybe, you know,
we can let slide.
Rubbish.
Sure.
But if you look at you know, the only film I find, Barry Lyndon is the one that sort of doesn't measure up.
Yeah,
you know?
Thank you.
The one that just doesn't measure up. The rest of them, you can see where he was going. In mystery,
Lolita's
industrial television, industrial military, industrial complex, the Hollywood pedophilia obsession, the transhumanist agenda. It's all there in Kubrick's films. You know,
power elites.
Yeah.
Like when you connect the second party of Eyes Wide Shut, the masked party, to the kind of the fancy ball in the gold room at The Shining, when you realize those are essentially the same people, not the same people, but the same team, the same group or whatever, you're like,
sure, yeah.
Whoa.
I mean, you get directors like Quentin Tarantino who have attempted to create, you know, sort of a character family mythos. You know, so that certain characters turn up in some films in the past and other films they're referenced to and so on. But, you know, Kubrick did that. He did that seemingly effortlessly through the lens of a camera, not through overt naming of characters and things like that. You know, there's there is absolutely no doubt that what you're witnessing in the ritual sacrifice scenes of Eyes Wide Shut is almost like it's how, the girl in Lolita, it's kind of what you think that's what she ended up as. You can make that connection. She's kidnapped from a hospital by a character that Kubrick, in the books, the character's hardly an issue in the books, but I'm talking about the quilty character played by Peter Sellers, who's so obviously, a metaphor for the Hollywood front system of taking young talent, destroying them, putting them through this meat grinder,
the ringer,
sexual exploitation. So that girl gets kidnapped in that movie, and you can almost see that her type is the one that ends up being the focal point of the sacrifice. The girl that ends up dead from overdose in the newspaper. We don't actually see the sacrifice, but we're talking from 1962 to 1999. That connection is still running through. Yeah. It's almost, what happened to Lolita? Well, go and see what happens in Eyes Wide Shut to that.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Any with Lolita, maybe to a lesser extent, but absolutely with Dream Story, Traum Nouvelle, he was very passionate about that. And, he wanted to do that for good, give or take 30 years of his career. So, it's on his mind the whole time. And
yeah, well, he would have, a lot's come out recently. If you look at, Kubrick's sort of career at the very beginning, there's a person involved in it that he kind of has nothing more to do with after 1963. And I'm talking about Kirk Douglas.
Okay, sure.
All right, okay. And Kirk Douglas, he lived into, what was he, 102 when he died?
Yeah.
Something quite recently, or something along those lines. And even in the 1990s, when I was becoming very interested in, working in the film industry and so on, I'd heard talk about him raping Natalie Wood when she was a 16-year-old. And, that as a result of that, Natalie Wood was a very damaged person, leading up to her rather ambiguous death, drowning of a boat, with Walken and her husband at the time, what's his name? Yeah, Robert Wagner, sort of being part of the scene there. But you can put two and two together, and I just wonder how much Kubrick saw Hollywood in its real form because he had close contact with Kirk Douglas. Now, it's not just a Natalie Wood thing. Have you seen those pictures of Douglas frolicking with a very young, I think she was 14 or 16-year-old Bridget Bardot on the beaches of Saint-Tropez? I mean, this is creepy stuff. And, we know that Bardot would come under the influence of a guy called Roger Vadim, who was the main guy in propagating the sex kitten imagery of the late 50s, early 60s. That and he had a whole string of women in that mold, started by Bardot, then Fonda, then Strasberg, I think the name was, or something along those lines. And I could see you've popped it up on the viewing screen.
Do you see that there? Okay.
This is. What's Kirk Douglas at this time? I think Kirk Douglas is 37, 38, possibly even 40 at this time. And, there he is. Bardot is so young, she's still a brunette. Jeez. Yeah, it's all there and so on. It's all there. And this is not even from a film set. This is
exactly. Beach. Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm. And it's just sort of looking at them all and so on like that, all in one go like this again. It's been a while since I've seen them. It is actually quite awful that a man of Kirk Douglas's age and so on could feel that free to frolic around with what is essentially our tweens. And so Kirk Douglas, I think, was Kubrick's window into how Hollywood actually worked, because I don't think we know even 5% of Kirk Douglas's deprivations and what he did. He wrote a biography of things, and I thought he was an absolutely terrible human being, the way he described some of his sexual, it's an old saying, a gentleman never says, never tells, and so on. But he was quite happy to discuss his sexual conquests, his description of Rita Hayworth, his sexual conquest of her. If more than anything, it's evidence that Rita Hayworth was one of the most damaged people through incest that Hollywood ever had, and he took full advantage of that. So that's where I think Kubrick was. He could see what was going on, through Kirk Douglas was his window in. That's why I don't know. I can't say because, I've never spoken to his family or read things or anything like that, but it does seem to me that his falling out with Kirk Douglas is what led to him deciding that's it. I'm living in Britain. I'm not going back to Hollywood, and I'm going to expose this crap.
Okay. And then I've heard of some stories, whether it's true or not, of course, with Kubrick and Ryan O'Neal, and Kubrick's daughter.
Worst dad in Hollywood history.
Ryan O'Neal? What I don't know much about him.
Just the way Tatum O'Neal was brought up and so on like that. He's without doubt, he's often pointed out as the absolute, he's sort of the byword for the worst dad in Hollywood history. In terms of all that sort of stuff. Tatum O'Neal, I think, had a pretty tough upbringing as a Hollywood kid.
Okay.
And Ryan O'Neal was particularly bad. But yeah, tell me more about where you were going with Ryan O'Neal and Barry Lyndon.
So I would have to do, a rough check to get my, not facts, but just as a refresher. But and this is something that I will be looking into more for my Kubrick special, but there was rumors, unsubstantiated claims, whatever, that Ryan O'Neal was essentially abusing or harassing and abusing Vivian,
Kubrick's
I believe. Yes. And I think he found out and just, kind of flipped.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure if it was near the end of the filming, because I feel like he would have, I don't know. I mean, he fired so many people from that movie just at the start. I don't know at what point it was, but that was one other person that I remember I've heard stuff, and it was his own daughter. Right. Again, I'm gonna do some more looking into that. So in another episode, I'll definitely clear that up more.
Yeah, so we have that caveat that's sort of things that come about. But Ryan O'Neal, right, was the hottest stuff in Hollywood at that time. He'd done Love Story and so on like that. He was the golden boy. And such, and Kubrick already had a reputation. Got to work with this guy; he's the greatest director, and so on like that. Sure. But Ryan O'Neal's, how can you put it, sort of moral fortitude left a lot to be desired in a time from 1968 to about 1975, where any moral values were being absolutely destroyed. In terms of what Hollywood was actually promoting at that time. It was the time of Charles Manson. They nearly let the cat out of the bag. It's one of my things, that Charles Manson is absolute evidence that serial killing is often a part of an organized plan, that a lot of serial killers are what you would call fall guys and so on. And the cat was nearly left out of the bag because, Charles Manson didn't stick a knife in anyone, didn't shoot anyone, didn't write any blood over the walls or anything like that. He actually had no physical involvement with the actual killings, but he was the guy behind the manipulating of the people who went in and did those killings. And Dave McGowan's work on the whole sort of you're probably aware of the Laurel Canyon sort of stuff.
Yes, and Program to Kill. I believe he wrote that too as well, right? Yeah, I got that somewhere. Yeah, absolutely.
It's effectively we were seeing the time when the very successful Phoenix operation, Phoenix program in Vietnam was now being unleashed on the American public. And, this was the environment that Ryan O'Neal came out of. He looked like he was, clean cut and all American sort of a guy and so on like that. But these influences and something that Kubrick has never really, even in Clockwork Orange, he never really explored in the same way, was the role that drugs played, whether illicit, LSD, that sort of stuff. Even in Clockwork Orange, it's not really attributed to drugs, but
Well, what about their milk? Their drugged up milk.
Yep, and
then the one with the adrenochrome.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Genchrome.
Yeah. Well, I saw an article recently on the Zero Hedge website where somebody put out an article now that what was considered, complete conspiracy theory, weirdness and stupidity, this idea that the blood and bodily fluids of the young have been harvested for the benefit of older people, is now finally they're starting to admit, literally by saying the fountain of youth is the youth. In other words, so you're harvesting the stuff, and what they'll tell us is, yeah, it's no problem, it's no issue in harvesting stuff, and we've been transfusing blood between people for over 100 years and so on like that, and it's worked well and such, like these medical things. But what they don't realize is that if adrenochrome is what they're sort of talking about, and might be what Kubrick was.
I looked it up, and that's what it references.
It's been harvested from kids who have to be terrified.
Yes.
In order to produce something that is harvested. This is linked to adrenaline.
And quickly, not to sort of interrupt again, Dr. Sleep. That's what Dr. Sleep is about. It's about these ragtag, hoodlum-like evil beings. Hunting children, trying to find the most scared or whatever, but essentially scaring them for their steam. It's called for their steam. So they scare them, and the steam comes out, and they suck it, and they get power. And they get power,
which is obviously a metaphor for
absolutely. So I don't know what Stephen King. I feel like we're in the age of, not to sound too paranoid, but it's when it comes to Hollywood and authors and famous people per se, I feel like we're at the point where I feel like I just can't necessarily trust anyone at face value. I kind of have to take a step back and be like, Jesus Christ. And there's the guy so many who coined it.
The guy who coined it, Jordan, I believe, was Hunter S. Thompson. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. The adrenochrome? Yeah.
Because it's in the movie, right?
It's in the movie, such. And, Hunter S. Thompson was still alive at the time of that making of that movie.
And they're just another guy that, sketchy. Well, everyone hails that guy, but,
I know.
You start looking into the Franklin scandal.
Yep. And the accusations he was the director behind some of the snuff porn. This kind of stuff that accusations have come down, get shut down.
In boroughs, like you said. Yeah.
In other words, back to what we're saying, it's no wonder Kubrick isolated himself from these people in virtually a castle.
Yeah. If he's not, exactly. And if he's not that type of person, absolutely. And I think that I think that speaks a lot to, people will say, oh, well, if that is what's going on, if that is how it is, then, he was probably into it too. And I know we're pro Stanley, so to speak, but I think his actions in the moving, and then also what he's trying to communicate, a lot of the stuff in his films, I think that speaks a lot to, I guess you could say, what side of the fence he was on. Let's just say that.
Yeah, sure. Like every one of us, flawed, had to make a buck to stay alive and so on, everybody goes through phases in life where we try to be a better person, and then we sink down and let the less good part of us come through. Everybody has that aspect about it, but Kubrick, this, whether people want to sort of attack him for who he is or what he wasn't or whatever, what Kubrick is for us is he's a witness. And his films are his testimony, and they don't like us knowing about this stuff that we can read into these films that you can't read into other films in the same way. You can't read it. You can read stuff into Spielberg's stuff that is very dodgy. You can read stuff into Lucas's films that are very dodgy, given two guys who are extremely successful on that side of things. And there are other directors that you can name that it's just outright overt what they're promoting and such. But Kubrick's films are standalone witness testimony to certain aspects, and he really did seem to be pushing that idea that the world's children are being preyed upon by an elite who see them as a resort. And let's face it, Hollywood is one of the greatest, how can you say, tools for pulling children away from the family unit in the pursuit of fame and fortune and just being part of the cool crowd.
I think it's called Finding Neverland is a great example of that. The Michael Jackson documentary. Just looking, Michael Jackson and his stuff aside, just looking at the episode where it talks a lot about the parents and their thought processes when they were being asked to send their children off. Well,
they live vicariously through their children, don't care what happens to them. And this is one of the reasons why Hollywood is ruled by dynasties of people. It's you often find out the connections there are there for anybody to find out. You know, just pick a name and you can find the connection that shows that they've been part of they have a family background that's vetted in for what Hollywood is really all about. And it's basically a giant pedophile recruitment industry that makes money through entertainment based on destroying the moral values of whatever established religion you come from. I mean, there's that old trope that Hollywood is full of Jews,
right,
and such. Okay, and where does that go? But let's face it, the Orthodox Jew is horrified by what's going on with some of the moral values that are put out in Hollywood. So it just comes back down to the fact that whoever these people are, they might claim to be Jews, but they're not Jews religiously. They're following a program that fits into to a world where moral values are what you want to make of it. And of course, my book Saturn Death Cult and so on, I go into all this about how it's the role of the Saturn. Why my mind's gone a bit blank on that. The Saturn archetype, the creator god Saturn archetype, and his connection to weights and measures, which starts with the fact that mythology gives Saturn that whole aspect of introducing the concept of calculated time. Time is a measure, all right, and that starts civilization. Without time, you can't say to somebody, "See you here next Wednesday at 4:00." and get something done. Nobody knows when that's turning up if you're living in a timeless world, which is, what my book talks about, the Purple Dawn, and how that changed with the advent of the Saturn god archetype, which I argue, in a short way is a consequence of interplanetary catastrophes that took place, within human memory. They provide us with all these symbols that find their way into a lot of Kubrick's films. As somebody who thinks along those lines, and everybody talks about symbolism and doesn't get past the Illuminati Satan type idea of what the occult. Kubrick is very credible to me because his symbology doesn't just jump into pentagrams and devil's horns and pitchforks and things like that. This guy is putting 8-pointed stars, symbology that is really only known to those who go and study ancient history and the mythologies of the world. And he's bringing this stuff up in connection with Hollywood, in connection with these sort of hidden pedophile elites, that control things all around. And, again, that comes back to Jay Weidner's take. I suddenly realized that the film 2001, because of what Jay was saying about it, and because of what I knew about a thing called Saturn theory, it's the thing that connected what I was studying that sounded like, well, that's the ancient world. How is it relevant to today's world, all this stuff? And it suddenly dawned on me that what Kubrick was saying is that this stuff is still what they do. All right, the Babylonian elites, the Ammonite elites, even the Israelite elites of the Bible, the Egyptian elites, the Roman elites, and then going into the Renaissance elites with recent information since I wrote the book that has come out, Game of Saturn, Peter Mark Adams' book, and so on. These books show a continuity of symbolic thought and connection right up to the modern age. And Kubrick had absorbed this. I'm sure he didn't understand. I'm sure Kubrick had a mainstream idea of how the solar system was formed and how physics works and so on like that. But he had absorbed enough from these elites that told me that they were still influenced by symbols that had lost their original meaning from the ancient world, but were governing how these people, pushed their ideologies on the rest of us. And that was my connection. That was it was through the Kubrick film 2001 that Jay Weidner said was essentially Kubrick's attempt to initiate us into what these people have planned for us, the evolution to the star child, the transhumanist artificial intelligence and agenda. And that was my connection that connected the theories of what Saturn theory was about, how it explained mythology as actual natural events that took place within the memory of the human species, but is now being exploited by elites as a way of programming and manipulating the vast majority of us towards their particular agendas. I'm not getting sound.
There we go. Sorry. There was a dog barking, so I just wanted to disrupt you. Yeah, absolutely, Troy. There's a lot of behind the scenes teams, so to speak, playing their long games of manipulation and corruption, and
they're part of a culture.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. They have their own. Absolutely, yeah.
When I talk about Saturn death cult, cult is the root word of culture.
Exactly,
and so on, and it just sort of comes back to the idea that a culture is far more effective at changing society than conspiracy. Conspiracy has too many gatekeepers, people who can decide other things there. But if we respond culturally to something, if it's presented as part of culture, and that's why symbols are so important. That's why control of the movie industry, the entertainment industry, is they define for many people what our culture is about. I mean, look at the mythos, that has been created about the American Wild West. In a 15-year period that has literally defined the culture of violence that, America has become. And, the Western world has followed through movies. How do you be a man? You're John Wayne or you're Clint Eastwood. These are our role models that are put forward, and they all have their symbols that, these guys didn't know. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood don't follow this stuff. Clint Eastwood is a better filmmaker than he was ever an actor. And some of his films are superb that he's done. But, these guys aren't aware over the long term, but they have all acquiesced to the portrayal of cultural values that have replaced traditional values based on things like religious scripture, these sort of more ancient sort of ideas that have come down to us, whatever your religion is, Christian, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam. This has been changed through the medium of entertainment and the symbolism used in cinematography, and nobody used it better to counter it than Kubrick did.
There's also, just interesting that you're bringing this kind of stuff up, that there's also the interesting aspect when you're talking about Hollywood, about Operation Mockingbird and the CIA and the FBI and what other agencies have their claws in Hollywood or Bollywood or whatever equivalents are around the world. For the stuff that's getting pumped out, and sometimes it's so ridiculous you can just see it, right? But sometimes it's not as easy to see, and you might not know what's going on. And it's interesting to hear when you do hear some of the stories of what kind of manipulation is going on. So I'm curious as to.
Well, I'll give you one example of what we were talking about with the adrenochrome. Okay, all right.
Sure. Yeah.
When vampires were first portrayed in movies, they were portrayed as very ugly, unattractive monsters. We're going back to the silent era, not Nosferatu, that sort of stuff. By the time of the 30s and going into the 50s with the Hammer films and all this sort of stuff, vampires were sexy as. Good-looking girls were the ones that got seduced, became vampires. You had all kinds of sexual tropes were created through Christopher Lee and Bela Lugosi's portrayal of what he was. Rather than a monster that stalked you at night, horrible concept, he became a seducer and so on, right? But the thing that is based around all of it is this idea of blood drinking, okay? And within a lot of esoteric thinking, blood has often been believed to be what is congealed light, all right? And because the let there be light aspect of the beginning of the world is linked into the Saturn creator god archetype, let there be light, the bursting forth of the light. That light is the blood of Saturn being, washed onto the world to create a wonderful paradise that became known as the Golden Age, hence the symbolism with light, with gold, the yellow color. And so therefore gold literally becomes the skin of the gods, the flesh of the gods, and blood is congealed light. Light is the blood of the gods. So by consuming blood, there's this idea that you're consuming congealed light, which gives you strength and vitality. Now, as we were talking about adrenochrome and so on, if you scare a kid enough, and the tragic thing about this is apparently the pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is a big part of the whole adrenochrome sort of thing. But it seems that of a certain ethnic group, particularly, the Haitian dark children, the black kids, and that they, when fired, when frightened, produce more of this stuff, and so, we start to realize, who is being exploited at the very, it goes into that idea. Why are these Haitian kids disappearing? Why is there such a massive, interest on the part of supposed adoption agencies?
Yeah, true, exactly.
For dark kids and so on, right?
Yeah, what are some of these sketchy people doing? Putting, like, what the hell is Bill Gates up to, or the Clintons, or like what's going on with And
so what Hollywood has done is that, through the ages, where films became more and more overtly based on the sexual type, the mystery school that is based on procreation, the Venus part of the whole Saturn mythology and so on like that, which is the idea of the love goddess, all this sort of stuff that you get from that mythology, worked into the vampire mythology, worked into what is going on, what we are now, what they're admitting is happening. The idea that harvesting from children may actually be some sort of cure to aging and retaining your own youthfulness and so on. Blood drinking has never been more sexy.
Yeah,
that's where we're at, and Hollywood has done this.
Yeah, man. Absolutely.
I put my hand up. I went to a number of vampire films because I thought I was going to see some pinup girl get off, and
that's a big thing too. Combining that pinup kind of style with vampires too. Yeah,
and yet it is a shockingly dirty concept that what you are doing is you are literally draining people of their life force for your own benefit. Couldn't be more exploitive if we tried.
Whenever, like, I mean, I don't, have you ever seen, there's one example from, it's ridiculous. Have you seen Nicolas Cage in The Vampire's Kiss?
Years ago, you'd have to remind me of that.
It's just a ridiculous performance of his. It's just off the top. But there's just a scene in it where it's while they're getting it on, and a woman is sucking his blood from the neck, and they make it very sexualized. And whenever I see that, like, whether it's usually when it's a girl doing it to a guy, I get, like, just because I scare myself into but whenever I see any sex or any form of it doing it to any other form, just the thought of that, like, they're draining one person and the other one's just building, and it's just it kind of freaks me out, but it bothers me in a way too. Like it definitely leaves its impact. So
and Hollywood has also emphasized the homoerotic that comes with the whole vampire mythology, and such, whether it's vampire lesbians or Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt and the Interview with the Vampire, these kinds of films and so on. So what they're doing is they are separating the idea of sex being a procreative act to one of being an act of sustained pleasure, and such. All right, and one can read in the whole adrenochrome thing that when imbibing adrenochrome and so on, it's just a general feeling of wonderful wellness that overwhelms the person that takes it in. It couldn't be more evocative of the whole vampire mythology that we have. And yet at the base of it is this, we saw it even in the Matrix films. Humans are being bled of their energy in order to sustain a machine world. And the physics don't work, as far as that goes, but the concept of a majority becoming the resource of an elite minority is pushed. And in this case, it's truly terrifying because we're talking about physical exploitation. It's not just economic or even ideological or religious. We're talking about the actual draining of blood from one group of people so that another elite group of people can sustain their feelings of youth for themselves and where they feel life should be for themselves. It's truly terrifying.
Absolutely. And again, Dr. Sleep is like a perfect example. I recommend you check that out because it is a perfect example of that. So it'll give you that piece, and then you can enjoy some Kubrick Easter eggs. But yeah, absolutely. There's one part, again, I won't give any spoilers, but this group that is chasing the kids, one of them is older. I think it's like pa or grandpa or whatever. And at one point where they haven't feasted or whatever in a while, you can tell that he's kind of, he's running around, he doesn't, pa doesn't look so good. So, and then once they feed, he's feeling good, 20 years younger. So
no, the concept has been pushed in Hollywood. It's been made sexy, and now it's hitting the mainstream, as in the young, absolutely, the young people can go now. Without sort of pushing my book and so on. Somebody reads my book.
Push it, man. Push it.
Somebody who reads my book is probably going to have an even greater understanding of the kind of symbolism that Kubrick did. Not because Kubrick was a Saturn theory guy or anything. He just had an innate understanding of the symbology of what goes in, what symbols work, how they can be exploited, and so on. 2001 is full of it. Eyes Wide Shut is full of it. And when you read the book, you'll see how it, a lot of this manipulation through the use of symbols that trigger archetypes within our subconscious and so on like that, has led to a world where, groups are exploited for the benefit of others. Now, in Saturn Death Cult, I tried to get people to understand the role played by the central banking system. And that has been, it's the most refined tool the elites have created for economic enslavement, in which we almost beg to be enslaved in this, prison of debt that the world has. But you will also see the stuff we're talking about, this symbolism that points to the idea that there is a kind of immortality on offer to humans, that it was enjoyed during Saturn's golden age, and that they are trying to create another Saturn golden age in which elite humans rule as Saturn, the god Saturn of mythology, ruled over his golden age. But in this case, that golden age is sustained by technological advances that allow the right humans, in inverted commas, the elites, to live in a world in perpetuity that they control in terms of its resources. And terrifyingly, one of those resources that we've been discussing is the youth and the general population as such. And that's what I believe that they're after. They are engineering a doomsday event to bring the world's population down to a manageable source from which they can then rule the world's resources for their own benefit, as the god Saturn once did. And this is the aim of these occult groups. This is what you're seeing in Eyes Wide Shut.
Absolutely.
With these rituals and so on. It's the way they invite people into these sacrificial ideas and so on to be part of this group, so that you're what's the word? You're implicated in the crime, and therefore you're part of the people in the know. It goes a lot deeper than that. I've learned a lot in the last 10 years about why blood sacrifice, human sacrifice, blood drinking rituals are actually practiced by these loonies in terms of what they do. But it just boils down to the fact that you're now part of the inside group. And that inside group is believed to need 500 million people on the planet to live well, to live in their own golden age. We got 7 billion, 7.5 billion. So they got to get rid of 7 billion people. And I think they're doing it through enforced sterilization techniques, that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
And this 500 million, they're essentially to be, so are they to be used in various ways, like labor and whatnot, or just to the point where they're just nourishment? And
it's nourishment and maintenance.
Sure.
The way the technology works is something that there's two things that they can never ever, well, when I say never ever, have not to date been able to overcome. One is they can't create life. All right. Okay. The average human being who engages in a relationship with the opposite sex can create life through what's called procreation. All right. So the child that they have is a new life, a new identity, a new existence. And for those who are of a spiritual nature, it's a new spiritual force in the world. All right. They can't create babies. They can't create new life in that way. The closest they've come to that are computer viruses. All right. That's the closest in terms of artificial intelligence and so on. So they have never yet been able to imbue something to the spark of life is still actually beyond them. The other thing is that they have never been able to successfully create a chimera that can procreate, a hybrid. We live in a world where, again, Hollywood has done this incredible job of, through films like Star Trek and, TV shows like Star Trek and the later films and Star Wars. Star Trek, Captain Kirk is having it off with every alien in a skirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Around the whole thing. He's the great seducer of all the other peoples, implying that special procreation, is normal.
Right.
It can actually happen. Now, it can't happen in the actual real world. All right. So, for instance, our closest relative, the human, is closest related to the chimpanzee. There's something like only a 5% difference in terms of our genetic codes and so on with us and the chimpanzee. And Joseph Stalin went all out during the 1930s into the Second World War, trying to create a hybrid of a chimpanzee and a human who could be used for menial labor, because they'd have the strength of the ape and enough brain power to do what it was. But that was his plan. And they just could not create a hybrid. Now, a horse and a donkey are like 2%. And they can procreate. But what they procreate is a sterile creature called a mule.
Okay.
And mules cannot procreate with other mules. Maybe a female mule can be impregnated by a horse and you can get another generation, but they found out they're too sickly. So when you're making mules, you literally have to manufacture mules by mating horses and donkeys together. That's the only way it can be done. And you can do it in a test tube. You can do it naturally by, usually it's it's usually a mare of the horse with the stallion of the donkey to create the mules that people like to have for what they do.
Okay.
So they're in closer relationship than the human and a chimpanzee, and yet still they cannot actually create mules can't go off with other mules and breed more mules. All right, from that point of view. Now, in the esoteric traditions and in the biblical tradition, this comes back to the idea of what's called kind after its own kind. You are part of a species when you can have sex and procreate with that species. So within the human species, all right, in the genetic deviations from white to black, it doesn't matter. They can procreate and create healthy children that can procreate and so on. All right. So that means you're all part of the same species. You're not mules. Sorry, you're not donkeys and horses and such. You're all human. Now, what they have tried to do, and this is what Frankenstein stories from Gothic literature and so on have, Dr. Moreau's Island, the island of Dr. Moreau and so on like that. They've had this idea of trying to manipulate the human species to create a new species that is not dependent on the normal forms of procreation and such for the future. And the reason for this is that they need to be able to patent the human being. And the reason they need to patent the human being is because they need the human being as a resource. And they've done it with plants. They've created genetically modified plants and so on like that you've now got to get special license permission to be able to grow and so on like that, okay? If they can create a human 2.0 and such, all right, then that human 2.0 becomes the property of whoever holds the patent.
Right, sure.
All right, the licensed property of it. Humans, nobody can claim ownership over a human in terms of patent law, because no human has ever created an actual human in the sense of, it being a process of manufacture. It's always been a process of procreation. But if you can create a body of people who can be in perpetuity manufactured, like you manufacture mules, that are able to provide all of the resources that the original human needs to continue living forever, i.e., I'll just keep living because whenever I need a new liver, I'll just get a new one made up, all of this sort of stuff. You need that patent control over humans to have a legal basis for farming humans. All right. And sure. This is when they talk about the hackable human and what they're planning to do, this is why they want the world down to 500 million, so they can create their breeding processes and ultimately genetically manipulate or re-engineer the human species so it is genetically not the same as a natural human.
Okay.
As such, all right? And quite put simply, if there's 7 billion of us on this planet, that we'll override them all the time if we're allowed to keep breeding and carrying on as we do and so on like that. And that's what they fear. They won't have that kind of control like they would over 500 million. And they wouldn't have the ability to engage in programs of genetic manipulation that leads to this idea that, well, if you believe in a creator god archetype, the Saturn archetype, he has the patent over natural humanity because he created the whole of humanity according to that archetype. You can wrest that patent away from him by creating a human 2.0 that is now, it's now there as harvestable resource material.
Okay. Wow.
Dark.
That's yeah, I was literally just going to say that. Deep and dark. Yeah, absolutely, Troy.
And Kubrick's 2001, The Star Child. All right.
Yeah.
With the emphasis on artificial intelligence. And then, of course, the film he never made, and Spielberg went off to, I doubt it would have been anything near what Kubrick was interested in doing.
Yeah.
And such. But these films give us that transhumanist idea that we are being manipulated through engineering, breeding, whatever it is, but certainly through our cultural programming, to accept the idea that we are going to become something else other than human.
Okay.
The trouble with that is that something else will be owned by someone else.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for I'll throw this in controversially for some people who are not of the religious thing, but the idea of a supreme creator archetype being who has created the whole of creation, what you see, the living world, mineral, vegetable, and gas, whatever it is that you see there, it has philosophically always been the greatest bulwark against slavery. Why? Because if somebody who is a creation of that creator being decides he owns another person who is a creation of that creator being, all right, then what he's doing is he's actually engaging in theft. You see what I mean? Because the creator being has by right of creation the ownership of all that is within creation. So it stops other human beings enslaving other human beings based on that. But it didn't stop people developing religions that said, well, I speak for the creator being.
Yeah.
And he says he wants you to be owned by me.
Yeah, loopholes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, loopholes.
Yeah, okay.
But that's why religion, in all its flaws and so on, has been an unfortunate premise that people have used to enslave other people. We only need to see the history of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism to see that aspect of it. And yet at the same time, the basic idea behind it, that there is a creator God who owns all of creation by right of creation, means that nobody can claim to own me without, literally without being sold by God himself. And when did that happen? Where's your proof that God sold me
Where's
into
your bill?
Slavery? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. Yeah. But I mean, the people that are trying to do this, the stealing, so to speak, they don't care. They're not gonna follow any.
They do, in one sense.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in one sense they do. And it comes back to filmmaking again. Have you ever seen this phenomenon that it seems that when you get these events that obviously change our culture into a more controlled level of the police state and so on like that, 9/11, whatever it is that comes through, and I think it goes all the way back to the Victorian era when they started getting their head around how they could do this. have you ever noticed how people seem to pull up films or TV shows that go, my God, they were talking about this 10 years ago?
Sure.
They were,
Sure.
there's evidence of it,
Sure.
sort of like in it. And of course, this is Hollywood. Hollywood has been producing films that a lot of people can go back and say, those two skyscrapers that fell, that got knocked over on 9/11. Hey, guess what? Go and have a look at Fight Club. Go and have a look at the Lone Gunman TV show and so on like that. It's almost as if these guys were
the Lone Gunman,
predicting
yes.
it. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, the reason for that is because in the world that these people live in, they believe in the quasi-legalistic approach to gaining control. They don't want to just simply come and say, you're under my control, and if you don't go with it, I'm going to put a bullet between your eyes,
right,
and so on, because that doesn't work long term. There's enough of us, especially when we outnumber them 2 million to 1 and such, right? So they've got to have a mechanism that provides them with a legal justification. And one of those legal justifications comes out of the Bible and is used by groups all the time. And that is that when you go to declare war on people, you tell them, give up or we will do this to you. And you explain what you're going to do to them. And if they don't give up, then basically you can go in, and I think it's the 18th or 20th chapter of Deuteronomy. If you anybody who reads chapters 18 through to 24 can get a sense of how the biblical sort of government process worked, like things like, go to war. And what that does is by showing us through our entertainment in Hollywood, there is a legal justification of literally saying to them, hey, look, you're now human 2.0. We told you we were doing this. We made films about this. And you went along to it and you watched it and paid your tickets and you enjoyed it and so on. And because you did not go against it, by the legal definition, you accepted it. You signed the contract through, which is, as we know, completely different to all traditional concepts of contract and so on. Absolutely. You don't sign a contract because you don't say anything. You could make a contract and say, I had a contract with that guy to give me his house. Well, where's the signature? Doesn't matter. Yeah. I told him about the idea and he went, oh, it could work out. Yeah. Okay. But that's how they work. They believe that our acquiescence, our acceptance of the culture that they're pumping us full of through the mediums of Hollywood, through the mediums of government programs and the objectives that governments have when they get elected. The fact that you elect somebody who has intimated that they're quite happy genetically re-engineering organisms on the planet means that essentially you've given the go-ahead. All right, you elected them. That's what it is. And this is what these people have convinced themselves of. It might be evil, but you didn't say anything. You didn't do anything. In fact, you enjoyed what we gave you. And so therefore you agreed with where we were taking you, and it's a done deal. And that's what I believe the power of Hollywood has been used. It's a way of letting people know. And because we go along to it, we see it as entertainment and so on, and we don't say anything about things, we don't come out against it or anything like that. It is taken in the occult sense to be a, what's the word? I want to say acquisition, but that's not the word. We acquiesce to what they plan for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a concept that we've spoken about on this show a few times. It's we've also spoken about it like in terms of like a karmic sense. They're okay and they don't have to feel bad, so to speak, and lose any karma or anything, because like you said, they've shown it to us. They've told us in their mind, in their system of thinking, they've laid it out, and us taking it in and our lack of response, so to speak, is us signing a contract saying, okay, you have divulged this to us and we have accepted it in the sense that when we're going to be silent on it. Yeah. And one thing that every time it gets brought up on the show, that's an interesting thing that you've added to that not only do we take it, but we enjoy it, and it
becomes part of our culture, our way of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so on. And in that sense, they couldn't be more happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
We were talking earlier on, a lot of people who first go, especially young men who first see Kubrick's movies, they go, that's boring, that's crap.
Yeah.
I want to walk out of it. When you're going through the process in 2001, that last half hour, it seems to never end.
Sure.
So on like that. And this is not entertainment as we know it. So we go away from it, but something happens to a lot of us. It just sticks there in the brain, wondering, what was that really all about? And, these sorts of things. So Kubrick bucked the trend. He didn't make entertainment. He made initiations. He initiated us in to what the thinking was at the highest levels. And then it's our own responsibility what we do with that.
To think it through. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the value, and that's what makes Kubrick so unique in the world of filmmaking. There are great directors. There are great films. You can't deny Citizen Kane. You can't deny the Godfather films and so on. Coppola and some of David Lean's stuff is just astounding, in terms of just filmmaking, capability. And
David Lynch.
I can't really think of modern, what you would call a sort of modern director.
I'm a fan of Christopher Nolan. I know that
actually, I could see that.
I think that he's got some deep films and he's got some messages, and I think that he's done a good job with a lot of his movies. So I think he would be just someone to kind of Batman
was the most intelligent.
Take on
what is really a silly story.
Yeah, you could look at each movie individually, Troy, and break down what the message is and the themes, and absolutely, they're very deep. The Batman movies, they're great as Batman movies, but then when you want to cut into it and analyze, there's so much there. There's a lot of substance. Yeah. So
I like Ridley Scott's movies. Taken on, but he's kind of that Kubrick era, director. He's just after, Blade Runner was done in 1980, and so on. His movie The Duelist I thought was very good, but he's a visual master and such. But I don't know, his take of dialogue and the way he uses dialogue and his use of symbolism is clunky in comparison to Kubrick.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, I just personally, sort of find it that way. The Blade Runner, I think, is his masterpiece.
Okay.
In terms of all that, which again is the idea of artificial intelligence coming back to Earth to to confront its maker. In a world that is decaying and so on. Very, very good film. In terms, so it's based on a very good story. Android's Dream. Philip K. Dick, and so I put him in a certain level, but I'm not seeing any consistency in directors today who are coming out with films that are anything more than an attempt to be another $1 billion box office.
There's so many of those that it's absolutely. And I think that with that said, essentially every movie Nolan's done, except for maybe Following, I think that's his first one, Following. Maybe not even Memento, but after that, they're all, I think it was after Memento, give or take. He essentially earned the right to, demand a blank check with every project, and he got it, right? He's still
highly creative man.
Yeah, exactly. Him and he works with his brother a lot on that stuff, and I think he does a good job. And I think maybe it's not so much symbolism in the sense of something sitting on a desk or a painting or whatnot, but through his themes and through characters and through some of the lessons that he's teaching. Yeah, absolutely. I think he's good. And I heard somebody say that with Kubrick's work, particularly 2001. Even Eyes Wide Shut, you can watch the film backwards and still get all the symbolism. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's interesting. That's a whole other can of worms when it comes to Kubrick films, especially with The Shining. I think when it comes to running them backwards and transposing them onto each other, like there's some, that's going so deep, and that's like there's some videos out there though, Troy, that like people are finding some stuff, and you're like, oh my god, like. Oh, you don't know if you want to buy into it, right? But
of course, yeah. At the end of the day, it's the predictive quality of whatever the take on these things brings up. You know, the predictive quality of Kubrick, as you could say, 1962 is telling us that Hollywood harbored a pedophile network. You know, that was what is the basis behind his take on Lolita. Not there in the book, but it's there in the film.
Yeah.
And such, all right?
Yeah.
You can go to 2001 and you can say, you know, Kubrick is warning us against the dangers of transhumanism and artificial intelligence. You know, this is a full, 30 years before, the film AI came out, in terms of this sort of stuff. You can look at his take on Clockwork Orange and all the revelations that came out about MK Ultra. You know, you had the film The Manchurian Candidate back in the day, but Clockwork Orange doesn't give you a political thriller. Clockwork Orange gives you a cultural experience. And, it's the cultural aspect that Kubrick is throwing in your face, not the idea those damn Koreans, guess what they're doing to our men in Korea? They're turning them into assassins through brainwashing and so on like that. You know, our brainwashed subjects are just ordinary bad guys who, hooligans that run around, but it's in their culture. This is what is going to happen to them and why they're like it, as far as that goes. So Kubrick's predictive capacity in terms of releasing to us things that have now become, part of the general acceptance. We've had presidents apologize for MK Ultra. We've, they've admitted it. It's not conspiracy theory anymore and such. This idea, they'd like to tell us, oh yeah, but we stopped that back in the early 70s. Like hell you did.
Yeah, bullshit. Bullshit.
You've just refined it.
Renamed it. Yeah.
And that exactly. And so, it's that predictive quality that I think makes Kubrick's films so, the longevity is almost assured. And that, for me, the incredible thing is that we're still talking about 2001, Lolita, all these films. Who talks about Jaws?
Exactly, man.
Who talks about the blockbusters?
Other than a cheap Simpson reference or a quick 10-second clip referencing, not to, I'm pulling it from a Kubrick movie, but, here's Johnny, like I know, like stuff like that. But in other movies, but people don't understand. They're not
great for their time,
appreciated properly.
They were entertainment phenomena.
Exactly.
All right. That's what they were. That's, there's no doubt about it. They were made for that purpose. But with Kubrick, he was different from everybody else in the sense that quite literally through his career, every film was an event that people waited for.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Spielberg kind of achieved that by the early 1990s. And since Schindler's List, it's kind of dropped off the charts.
Yeah.
Lucas did that through his Star Wars films.
Yeah.
And that for a brief period of time.
Yeah.
But these guys were, the event was a franchise. All right. They, it was Star Wars, the next Star Wars. Or
it's
Indiana
different.
Jones.
It's different than, I think that's completely different. Yeah.
Dr. Strangelove to Lolita.
Yeah.
All right. To Spartacus up to 2001. Then he jumps into Barry Lyndon, soon after that, your Clockwork Orange.
Yep.
We know what the connections are, but these are all genres that are, it would be as if an author was a famous novelist, but every novel was a different genre.
Yeah.
The first one was a detective novel. The second one was a romance novel. The next one was a science fiction. There's very, very few authors that have ever pulled that off.
Yeah.
In the world of filmmaking, Kubrick's done it brilliantly. Barry Lyndon's the one disappointment for me.
Me too.
Out of all of them, I didn't get much out of that at all.
I can't and don't necessarily. I could admit I don't appreciate it for what he wanted and what he was going.
Kubrick made 2 war movies.
Yeah.
All right. Paths of Glory.
Yes.
All right. Which is an anti-war, film, and such. He linked him with Kirk Douglas. Yeah.
Love it.
And
love it.
And then which, Paths of Glory, let's face it, is really a court case.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's
absolutely
a story of justice, to people. And then he made something. For me, the ultimate Vietnam film is Apocalypse Now.
Me too. Just watched the other day, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a film that made me want to get into films. When I saw Martin Sheen's character sort of making his way when they had to get past the bridge, they had to go ashore, and he had to make his way past to get on the other side of the bridge about halfway through the film. And he's in that darkness, and he goes up there. You've got that black GI.
Oh, with the grenade launcher.
Yeah.
Who's in charge? Yeah.
Well, ain't you?
Yeah, exactly.
All that sort of stuff. It's the way he used the light in that process, the strobing lights, everything about it.
Flares.
It was an acid trip without having to take acid. And it came through, and it's a film I can watch over and over again.
Yeah,
and I had a very good friend in New Zealand who was a Vietnam vet. He was with Whiskey Company, New Zealand Whiskey Company in Vietnam. And I said, "Have you seen it? What do you think?" And he says, "I won't watch it because it's just a little too real."
Yeah,
he was quite happy to watch The Deer Hunter. He was quite happy to, to watch all the other derivative films and so on. But it was the same guy who told me, but if you want to see a Vietnam film, watch Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Yeah. Why? Because again, it's the destruction of the human individual in the pursuit of a overworldly controlling goal, that sort of breaks these people down so that they're less than human. It's 2001, the brutal opposite. This is what happens to the trash. You don't get to be the star child. You just get to be a cog in the machine of what's going on. And the fact he shot it in Britain.
I love it. I mean, when you watch some of the documentaries and you just see, put some palm trees up and put up some, that kind of advertising, that kooky advertising, and, just blow it up a bit more and then get some gas pipes going and get some flames going. It looks great. Looks great.
It's because we understand our world in terms of the relationships we have. Kubrick was the master of pinpointing the relationship, the characters and so on. It wasn't that they were in a war. He could have done that movie if he was shooting a Napoleonic. And I believe he wanted to do a big Napoleon type.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But, he understood, just in the same way as Francis Ford Coppola understood, that The Godfather wasn't a mobster film. It wasn't a mafia film. The Godfather was a family saga. And, he managed to pull it out. And I think it was Denzel Washington, who's taken the whole idea that it's culture that is everything, not race, it's culture.
Right.
And I remember reading that in the book Shibumi by Trevanian, the Japanese general telling his Caucasian, Russian American son, that adopted son, race is nothing, culture is everything.
Sure.
Sort of after the war and so on like that. Denzel Washington has said that. He said, people are too cut up in this idea of the race is not, you can't do things on race, because it took an Italian like Francis Ford Coppola to do The Godfather. It took an Italian like Scorsese to do Goodfellas, all right? In the same way as it took a Jew to do Schindler's List, and make it work, because those little cultural elements come through. It's a fact. The one of the most serious things that has ever happened in British history would be the 45, the Scottish Rebellion, the Jacobite rebellion against the Crown to reinstate the Stuarts. The Battle of Culloden, which is a very sore point in terms of that. It's only ever been done well by Scotsmen and Englishmen who've approached the topic. It's the same thing. Nobody's going to make a great film about the Chinese Revolution except a Chinese person who has that cultural background of family that went through it and such. These are important things that go into that. And with Kubrick, and that he was so clear on, it was always the relationship of sort of English language people within the Western experience, but at a very tight angle, very tight compartmentalization of character relationships. That meant that his films were not only watchable in terms of the narrative that he was saying, but he wasn't dependent on, that was the 1960s, or that was 1930s. And it's no longer relevant. Citizen Kane suffers from that, because it's unwatchable to people of today, because it's referencing a period when the newspapers, much like the the high tech people control our media and such like that. And it didn't really it didn't resonate by the time you got to the 90s and the early 2000s in that way.
Sure.
Kubrick's films they're not dependent on that. You can't say about Full Metal Jacket, it's the Vietnam War. It's every war.
Yeah. And I know we're kind of a kooky comparison, to use the word kooky again, but looking at like Full Metal Jacket and MASH. I mean, I love MASH, but it takes place during the Korean War. It aired during the Vietnam War, and a lot of the creators, when they're asked about it, excuse me, they say it's just about war. It's not about the Vietnam War. It's not about the Korean War. It's just about war. And I think they do a good job of that. Yeah. I mean, it is
Catch-22 is another one that's a good example.
Oh, okay.
Of that.
Sure. Okay.
They're great films outside of all of this and such. But like I say, if it comes to the Vietnam War, my two picks are Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket. Yeah. The Deer Hunter doesn't even come in there. Yeah, that's the most lauded.
Yeah, I think it's the Russian roulette scene that really kind of lifts it up a bit. Yeah, sometimes all it takes is
Welcome.
Yeah. Sometimes it just takes those memorable quotes or scenes to just lift a film higher than it necessarily should be, I guess you could say. But I would agree.
One of Welken's finest moments, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And I agree that with Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
I don't know, honestly. Like, I think there might be, top of my head, I can't think right now, another Vietnam movie I like more than Full Metal Jacket. I mean, Platoon's really good, but it's
a bit preachy.
So I was gonna say, when you take into account the preachiness and just the Vietnam-isms that they boost up a bit, it's just gets a little corny. So I mean, I think Full Metal Jacket does a better job at what it's trying to do. But with
Full Metal Jacket is simply how the human individual responds to the brutalization of his individuality, and it's different for all people. And Kubrick was, he always wanted to show war as the ultimate crime.
Yeah,
it's to put people into those circumstances and things like that. It's one hell of a thing to, we live in an age now where politicians are quite happy sending people off into war zones because they think it's all a video game. It's all done with technology and so on, but
numbers and stats, and they're not seeing the effect firsthand necessarily.
No. As they say, what was it one guy said? It's war is 10% boredom, 90% pure terror. Okay. And I remember reading somewhere that it takes exactly 16 seconds for the person who goes to war thinking it's going to be glorious to change his mind once the bullets start flying. And it just changes it completely. My own family's experience war is the Second World War, where my grandfather came back after a prisoner of war, experience and so on like that. And it was still an age where people who came back from that were not looked after. Were not, they was just, man up about it and all this sort of stuff and that. But, his alcoholism was almost without doubt a result of his experience as a German prisoner of war of the Germans. And that sort of impact that it would have on his family through the 1950s, and my mother was a direct result of a society that still glorified the concept of charging into battle, but never looked after the people who came back from that.
And I think there's a good argument to say that it's still not handled properly.
Oh yeah. And I think it's become that way because a lot of people, Americans, have become almost soft to the war in the sense that it's something that happens, over video screens and through news shots, things like that. And that technology has changed the nature of war. And, as a result of that, they don't see any difference psychologically to people who are controlling a drone.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to bring up drones. That's huge.
Yeah.
Huge to that distancing your perception and understanding of what's really going on and what you think is going on and how it affects you.
Indeed. Yeah.
Just to, I know it's far back from your point, but when you mentioned Kubrick films you're waiting for the next, it's an event, you're waiting for the next event, right? It's interesting when you're watching interviews with people like Martin Scorsese, who he's talking about going with his friends, and he's waiting for the next Kubrick movie, right? Because I think to an extent, depending on how big of a fan of Scorsese you are, I think there's been some times where you're kind of like, okay, the next Scorsese movie's coming out. I think he's kind of lost me with some movies, and now he's kind of hit or miss. But I think almost depending on what movies you like, I think Christopher Nolan's almost like that to a lot of people as well. The next Christopher Nolan movie's coming out.
Lucas and Spielberg had it for a time period, for a time being. But if Nolan decided he was going to do I can't think what genre would be so far from what people associate Nolan with.
Right.
But if he decided to do a children's animated comedy.
Yeah, there you go.
Something like that.
Yeah.
A lot of people would scratch
comedy.
their heads.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people would scratch their heads. But with Kubrick, it would be, let's see what he's going to do.
What is exactly what's he got up his sleeve? Yeah.
Have you read anything? There was talk he wanted to do a porn movie. And such.
Really?
He wanted it to be literally, big time. So the movie would be the expression of a big time Hollywood director who decides to do a porno. Okay. And I'm talking hardcore,
meta,
and such like that. Okay,
sure. Yeah.
So he was sort of looking at it from that point of view. I know that what's his name? Girlfriend Experience guy, good director. Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, and great films.
I don't know.
Steven Soderbergh.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
Okay, all right. He's
got some good stuff.
Yeah, and he went into the realms of casting real porn stars and things like that to sort of explore that side of stuff and things like that. I can't remember what I read about Kubrick where he shelved the idea. I just felt he couldn't. It probably was maybe even a step too far for him, if you know what I mean.
Possibly. A big reason that if it wasn't for Steven Spielberg, he may have he would have pushed further with Aryan Papers, but it seems that at some point he may have backed down anyways, because there's a lot of quotes that you can find, especially from his wife, where he's saying like, how can I put this on screen? How can I show people this? It's just too much. Like, I'll be actually scaring people. And it goes into what you were saying about them having a connection, a family connection or a past connection. And part of his family had that connection. So there was that, there was that motivation in that connection, saying connection. But there's just that connection for him to put that emotion and that drive into it, that it, could have stirred up a lot of stuff.
With Schindler's List, we get the visual aspect, the immensity of people into the gas chambers, the sadistic cruelty of the SS commandant, the executions, that sort of stuff. These are all cinematic moments that, sear themselves into your eyes and you sort of understand it. Kubrick be more interested in the relationship aspect.
Yes.
And so on, which would be along the lines, how could you do something? How could you follow orders, along these lines? It's quite possible that he was suffering the same thing that a lot of people have trying to translate H.P. Lovecraft work into film. Okay. H.P. Lovecraft works in the audio realm and in the written word realm extremely well, but people often fail in translating that psychological horror of the individual. And I'm sure Kubrick was going to try to capture what a Jew on his way to the gas chambers might have thought, these are the things that he would have been interested in, as opposed to the camera pulling back to see the enormity of what's going on.
Exactly.
From a sort of eye of God point of view that Spielberg uses in Schindler's List.
Exactly.
And, it's not to say that Schindler's List doesn't sort of portray the psychological angst of, people like Schindler himself, the character played by Liam Neeson and so on.
Sure.
I'll tell you something I read only recently about Kubrick, and, when we talked about doing this, that I didn't realize Kubrick had a notorious reputation in his early days to surprise actors or people with events that were contrary to what they thought they were acting out in order to get a real reaction. So he staged a scene my understanding is he staged a scene on a film set. He went to, cover behind the scenes when he was a photographer for one of the newspapers. And he staged a scene of a what you call it, not a controversy, but a confrontation between a woman and a man, where the man had no idea the woman was going to slap him in the face.
Okay.
All right. And as I say, the picture that made it was the total surprise and shock of the guy after being slapped in the face. And when I was working in film, I remember I did a similar thing. It wasn't because I knew Kubrick, because I found this out, sort of recently. I tried the same sort of thing. I'd heard people do this.
Okay.
And I was basically shooting some stuff for a TV show about an Australian rock band playing in Hong Kong. We had the lead singer was going to be interviewed by this girl, this woman presenter who was a model of note, a L'Oreal sort of shampoo type model, and that she was well known and such. And I told the singer, I need a shot of her being completely surprised about something or whatever, and that she's going to ask you a question, all right? And I want you to just say, I'm sick of this shit, I'm not doing this, and walk off, and so on. And I got it. I got this, I've never seen something happen on camera that was so real, so visceral, in terms of what happened to the girl's face. She was shocked by what happened. And it seems Kubrick did the same thing.
Yeah.
And he seems to have used that technique quite a lot.
Yes.
And it pissed off a lot of actors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I just kind of
you're destroying the trust, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I know that this girl sort of went, okay, well, you got the shot, but don't ever do it again.
Right. Yeah.
And, I've never used it again, because I could see how that's very unnerving for somebody.
Okay.
Very traumatic. But I think Kubrick was, quite often he employed this technique, it would have seemed.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh shoot, I forget what I was going to say. But yeah, he definitely had kind of a toolbox of different tools and ideas that he used to stimulate and motivate and try to get some raw stuff that's different. And I mean, I think that a lot of that goes into all his multiple takes. I know it seems clear to me that him being notorious for taking thousands of takes of every scene is not true. Mm-hmm. There have been instances where he's done a lot of takes, and I think The Shining with Scatman Carruthers and Danny, that scene has like 148 takes, and I think might have a record or something. But I think that sometimes he's doing that for a reason. Mm-hmm. And you could also, I think Malcolm McDowell, he talks about in Clockwork, for the most part, most scenes, there weren't many takes. They got what they needed. And I think there was just one scene near the end where he took quite a few takes. But other than that, so I think maybe he did that for effect. When it comes to Eyes Wide Shut, I wonder if he's trying to literally, because there's definitely some takes, some scenes where it's been confirmed that there were a lot of takes. So you wonder if maybe he's trying to kind of wear some of these people down because of the whole dream aspect of the movie. So you wonder what's he thinking? What's he doing? So,
well, I mean, one of the greatest directorial stories is Ingmar Bergman, when he had, what was his name? The Greta Garbo.
Okay. Yep.
No, was it Ingmar Bergman? I can't remember. It was Queen Christina anyway, the film. That wasn't Ingmar Bergman.
Okay.
I can't remember who the director was. But that scene at the end where she looks into the distance and so on was done purely by the director getting somebody to hold up a blank card in front of Ingrid Bergman, and he told her, just keep looking at it until I say cut.
Okay.
And apparently he didn't start rolling the camera even until 5 minutes had passed, which is an eternity in that sort of situation.
Yeah. Okay.
So that 50-yard stare that she achieves, at the end of that, is something we all know. You can't create the 50-yard stare unless it actually happens to you.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people, try to do that for war films and things like that. And it's very difficult, to get the look of like the American guys on Okinawa you know, during the Second World War, where we see them and they have that 50-yard stare that's been captured once the fighting stopped. But he achieved that through, you know, there was no motivation, nothing. He actually pushed her into a form of boredom where she must have been started thinking, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? You know, it just sort of, it just went out of the eyes. And, you know, that's another one of those famous sort of scenes. I attempted to try that with somebody when I was doing student films. You know, I thought, great, I heard about this, so, you know, I'll see if I can sort of do it. And it didn't work because everyone's like, what are you doing? You know, well, you haven't even put the camera on. You know,
but with,
you know, it's like, well, I'm
with
trying
Kubrick,
to do what this
though, exactly. With Kubrick, it's like no questions asked, just do what you're gonna do, right?
And that's the thing, the American approach to film, the director is God, you know, in those films and so on. And you know, a lot of people have a lot of criticism of Americans. I've seen Americans work who have come to Hong Kong to do films and so on, and they are without doubt, even though we know all the stuff about Hollywood and we know about what's going on behind the scenes, and there are awful people who think movies are just a way to become famous, as opposed to they want to get into movies for the art of cinema, so to speak, and something like that. The ones that I worked with behind camera, stunt people, that kind of stuff, or not even that I worked with, the people I saw working, and a couple of very famous actors as well who did some scenes in Hong Kong with some Chinese films and that. The level of professionalism is on a different planet compared to what you get in Britain or in Hungary, where I worked a little bit, what you got in New Zealand, Australian actors, and certainly compared to the Hong Kong scene, which is as cowboy as it gets. You know, as far as that goes, the professionalism of actors. I remember doing one scene with a big named now actor and so on, who'd come to Hong Kong to shoot a film, and he had to give this speech. He was playing an FBI agent at the end of the table who was demanding he got more resources from the Hong Kong police, you know, stare down between the Hong Kong police and the FBI. That kind of a scene, real cartoon. But we had a guy in the scene who kept trying to hog the camera. He was an extra. He kept trying to hog the camera by, you know, gently moving over and so on like that. And, you know, you could see this happening. And it was the kind of thing that if Hollywood is meant to be what it is, you know, you think somebody like Nicolas Cage, for instance, would just go off as, no, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. You know, all this sort of stuff in there, okay? But the director would sort of come, what are you doing to this guy? Oh, whatever. And then he would try to sort of get in the camera by, you know, sort of going to the back and so on like that. He was trying to mug the shot. Okay. And so on. This is outrageous. So this was an intense piece. This actor didn't miss a beat. There was no looking at the guy, get your act together or anything. He just kept doing what he was paid to do and doing it perfectly every single time. And that's when I saw the true professionalism of what it takes to make it in the Hollywood scene. Okay. And so on. And you know, so I think, you know, guys like Cruise, people who worked with Kubrick on that level where you hear stories, I think it wasn't really anything out of the ordinary in terms of professionalism. You know, it was, Kubrick's sets were obviously extremely professional in that regard, you know? Yeah.
There's always the comment that there's always very, very few people on the set compared to average Hollywood sets and what everyone else in the business seems to experience. They seem to be surprised at that. Yeah, Kubrick absolutely
had a minimalist.
Absolutely.
Crew and all that.
I think just almost any documentary, not any, but a lot of them, there'll be at least one person that'll make a comment to, you know, you'd walk on the set and there's nobody there. Like he was pulling this off with very
just the minimal requirements, and that's fantastic. I didn't know that.
And that's another reason why, like when it came to filming, like he'd always say, you spend all this freaking money to get the actors here, to pay the actors, the set, the costumes, and then you set everything up, and then you want to get 2 or 3 or 4 cuts and go and move on. Why don't you want to? So that's why he would just film and experiment and film and try new things. And because he that's the cheapest part, and he doesn't have all these extra salaries. Like the crew is very skeleton,
very minimalist,
and he was able to do it that way. Yeah. So
I knew he fought he fought over setups.
Sure.
You know, the average Western film will have 10 to 15 setups in a day in terms of moving cameras around. There was some film, it might have been Spartacus, where they were demanding 35 setups a day, which is sort of approaching the craziness of being on a Hong Kong set.
Okay.
And so on. But Kubrick, I always understood, operated on 2 to 3 setups in a day maximum. What a luxury.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. What a luxury.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just a quick story to add to your, that funny piece you had about the extra, you know, trying to
climbing in on the shot.
Scene steal. Timothy Carey, if you're familiar with him, he is the gentleman in The Killing who shoots the horse, and he is the tall soldier in Paths of Glory. You know, he talks unwanted. I forget what he calls them, like an unwanted something. He got kicked off of this. He got fired from Kirk Douglas's Ace in the Hole for scene stealing. And then he gets the job with Kubrick years later. And then after that, he gets the job with Kubrick and Kirk Douglas in Paths of Glory. And what does he do? He freaking stages a fake kidnapping of himself.
Really?
To just get his name out there and just to try to build himself up. Yeah. And that went horribly wrong. I don't know the details as to like who found out what and what happened, but yeah, it was found out. And it's just interesting because he's like, what's his name? Greenstreet or whatever from Casablanca.
Right,
he's Sydney. Yeah. He's in a lot of Bogart movies. He's such a scene stealer in the sense that he just takes the show and just dominates the screen. And he's all the scenes that he's in, whether it's Paths of Glory in the courtroom scene or, you know, when he's crying in the cell or whatnot, that's who you're focused on, right? And I think in the last scene of Paths of Glory, it's not even him in the before they take him out of the cellar, because they had fired him at that point and they had to finish the scene. So
fascinating.
Yeah,
I mean, I've always been fascinated. You know, the great scene stealers. Klaus Kinski is, you know, one of the top sort of ones. Father Anastasia Kinski. You know, he's, you know, another favorite director of mine, the German Werner Herzog. His film Augeri, Wrath of God, and Scaraldo. He did, you know, with Kinski, and apparently, you know, Augeri, Wrath of God, which is very much like, you know, Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad film, that Apocalypse Now. Yeah. Francis Ford Coppola referenced Augeri, Wrath of God quite a lot in his Apocalypse Now, that journey up a river, discovering the darkness of humanity and so on. But that was a film, by all accounts, which reached the point where Werner Herzog pulled a gun on Klaus Kinski and said, "Act, motherfucker, act." And
wild,
you know, you get that sort of a thing. And you know, but Werner Herzog's films are superlative. You know, Augeri, Wrath of God is, I just think it's fantastic the way it's done. You know, this whole idea of mankind taking on nature, but ultimately being defeated by its sheer enormity and being changed by it and so on. That's Herzog's sort of approach. And but Klaus Kinski, you see him in Dr. Zhivago, you see him in For a Few Dollars More.
I'm looking him up right now,
and so on like that and such. He has to have been the greatest scene stealer in cinematic history. You just could not stop watching him. You know, even with Lee Van Cleef in the scene.
Right, yeah.
You know, Klaus Kinski was, you know, chewing up that scenery, but you know, a very troubled man, very troubled. Okay. But well worth a sort of look at those times. You know, it seems to have been a golden age of this kind of thing, where you had these people working in the cinematic industry that were, you know, like Kubrick's, like Herzog's and so on. I mean, Herzog, he filmed the whole of Augeri, Wrath of God with a stolen camera. You know,
really?
Yeah. You know, he went to some German university that had the latest 35mm handheld, and he just took it with him to South America. And, you know, didn't tell anybody about it. I mean, he infamously unleashed hundreds of thousands of white rats in, you know, the film too.
Okay, yeah.
They did with Kinski, and that the effect where all the rats run off the ship in the Dracula story and infest the town.
Yeah,
I think that place had a rat problem for years because he pulled that particular stunt and so on. And but there's a certain magic with this sort of renegade approach that a lot of these guys had and such. And to a certain extent, I think Kubrick had a very similar.
Yeah.
I think that's why he had to have that. He had to have that control over the cinema. Over the production that I don't think any director has ever had the kind of control that Kubrick has had for the size of production.
No, I don't think so. I've come across comments in readings and even documentaries where there's people high up in the industry, and they talk about that and just the clout and the pull that he had with studios. Like Warner Brothers, like when it came to, I think the best example might be when he finally decided to pull Clockwork from Europe, I think from UK theaters, when things were just getting very bad with violence, and he was getting blamed for it, and the movie was getting blamed for it, and eventually he pulled it. And a lot of people look to that as pretty impressive because he was able
Spielberg at his height would never have been able to do that.
Right.
Something just crossed my mind as you were saying that in terms of the studios and so on. It is true that his ability to maintain a relationship with the major studios while not even living in Hollywood and being part of the game that gets played out there and so on. Of course, that's where Widener believed that was achieved as the payoff for faking the moon landings.
Sure.
As such, whether one wants to go with what Widener's general thesis is, film technology speaking, I think Widener was onto something, because
let's talk about that. You cool to talk about the moon landing for a few minutes and just your thoughts on it, since we've dabbled around it.
Personally, I have my doubts about the original, the Apollo 11, but all the other ones, I think they went there.
Okay.
I can't understand why, with all the satellite technology and everything that we've got now, they just simply don't take a photo of the landing site. The flag has to still be there. The footprints, all that kind of stuff, they should be able to be seen. And it's very interesting that other countries who have sent moon probes, China, India, and certainly Russia, who was on the moon with a probe before America, none of them have come through and said, well, here's, we know the location. The location is on the other side, the side we never see from Earth. Okay. So we can never verify it with a backyard telescope or anything like that. Hey, look, there's the flag. You can see it, standing up there. So these are things, and I think for me, the biggest tell-all that something needs to be investigated is that America, since the ending of the Apollo missions, has never been back to the moon. And for some strange reason, the Apollo 11 data that was recorded, all the tapes have been wiped.
Yeah, they were destroyed, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so you don't have that data for future stuff, to go on or anything like that. Why would you destroy that data? I mean, it literally would be like destroying all the film footage of Hillary getting to the top of Everest in 1953, because, we wanted to use magnetic tape for something else or whatever. No, this is the first climb, of Everest. This is the first group of guys on the moon. Surely their data is the most important, should be preserved beyond. So it's that stuff that makes me very suspicious. It's also the groomed look of the astronauts as they come out of the capsule. Compared to other astronauts that went, whether it was Apollo 13 or 18 or all these guys that came back, they had the 3-4 day stubble. They had the lank hair, that you would expect somebody being, stuck in a small compartment to have. Yeah. Armstrong and Aldrin and all those guys came out looking, so you could argue, hey, these guys reenacted it and they had time to tidy themselves up. And, was the Kennedy, it was soon after the Kennedy era when people wanted to look good for camera. So you can give them that. But here's the thing that I have never, ever been able to, to accept on the part of people who debunk the idea. Okay. And that is that the shots, the photographs taken by the astronauts on the moon from cameras placed on their chest.
Okay.
All right. Okay. If you've worked in filming if you've worked in any form of photography or whatever. So I've worked in television news. I've worked with fashion photographers as their assistant. I've worked in feature film making and documentary making and so on. You have what's called a ratio when it comes to the footage used. And the average ratio when I first went into television news, you had to come back with what was called a 6-to-1 ratio.
Okay.
So for every minute that would be used, you were allowed to waste 6 minutes, especially back in the days before videotape. When videotape came on the scene, that ratio jumped to 1-to-15 and all that sort of stuff. All right. Okay. But even the fashion photographers, go on, love, hit a pose, click, 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 click. If you could see the amount of photographs that never make it, never go, that gets used on those shoots, especially back in the days, again, of film and so on like that, those guys are shooting 1-to-35, 1-to-40, 1-to-50 ratios. The one shot out of 50 might make it to the magazine, out of maybe 1,000 photos they'll take in the shoot in their day. The astronauts who were not photographers, who were wearing their cameras on their chest, all right, had a ratio, an unbelievable ratio of 1-to-1.
I was like, he's not going to say 1-to-1. Maybe he'll say 1-to-2 or 1-to-3. 1-to-1. Okay.
Okay. 1-to-1. That's near perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So there were a couple of things where something didn't work. So if you have a roll of film of 100 photos, maybe 2 of them didn't come right. But everything else was beautifully exposed. And here's the kicker, framed like a photographer, like an artist would do it. All right. They are perfectly framed. They're nothing like the later shots and so on. You've had guys like Hoagland and so on who claim, yes, they went to the moon and they saw glass domes and all that sort of stuff, but they were there on the moon. And the fakers, all that sort of stuff. And they say the camera was using film. You could not take a bad picture with it, but they're missing the point.
Yeah.
It's not the exposure.
Yeah.
It's not the thing.
It's not the
framing. It's the framing of the shot. All right. And here's, when I listen to what Jay Widener says about Kubrick being involved.
Right.
And everything that we've talked about today about Kubrick and his perfectionism.
Yep.
I can see that as the unforeseen element that they didn't pick up on would happen if they unleashed a guy like Kubrick.
Right.
Stage. I think everything would be framed beautifully. And so there is no way you can run around. We see today, the cops with their body cams.
Yeah.
Some of that stuff is impossible to figure out what's going on.
Absolutely.
Now, these guys were taking an almost 1-to-1 ratio, all right, of a great shot every time. And it's not because of the exposure. It's not because of the quality of the film. It's their framing. And to me, that is the biggest question, because it's not there. It's not there in the subsequent missions. But it's there in that first mission. And the one that really made me think, I've got to question this and keep on questioning this, was the lens flare episode. All right, where you see a rainbow effect.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Yes.
And it's a famous shot on it. Okay. Hoagland and all that would have us believe that that's because the image was coming through the glass that they discovered up there. This great big sort of dome glass thing that was there. Widener believes it is one of the glass beads of the 3M front projection stuff that Kubrick was using for 2001. If one of those things is not perfectly set and so on, it will catch the light and refract it and such. And I think, to me, that makes more sense than the idea that there's a great big, dome of glass up there that the astronauts discovered a civilization or something along those lines. I'm more of the idea that Kennedy put America on an almost unbelievable trajectory to beat the Russians to the moon.
Sure.
And it was going to happen no matter what. And, we were talking about they always show you stuff in the films that seems to, after the fact, go, gee, they showed us this.
Yeah.
Look at the movie Capricorn One. Capricorn One is about a guy who discovers the moon landing is being staged in a film a film soundstage out in the middle of the desert and such. And off he goes. You know, it's a very sort of Hitchcock-like thing.
Oh,
chased
okay.
by
Elliot
aircraft
Gould
and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's okay. But, you know, so that idea that the moon landings were faked and such was already out there at the time. I think Capricorn One was what, 71?
1977. And just to add, we got O.J. Simpson rocking this too. James Brolin and O.J. Simpson and Hal Holbrook. So I'm watching this tonight. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right on, man. I've never seen this.
It's quite a fun movie.
It looks good. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Right on.
It's quite a fun. I think the book might have been 71.
Okay.
That it's based on.
Heard of the book, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, but so, you know, this is before anybody even remotely contemplated that these things might have been faked.
Sure.
So it's the refraction of light in the one shot. It's the perfect camera framing, you know, almost on 100% basis for it. It's the incredible admission that they've wiped all of the magnetic data in terms of the bodies of the astronauts on that time. Those three make me very suspicious of it. And, you know, I can say I don't believe in it or anything like that. I'm always open to more evidence and such. I wasn't there. I'm not an insider in any respect. So you know, it could have happened. It couldn't have happened. But those data points ring very, very strongly for me.
Fair enough. Mm-hmm. I'm in a similar position where I'm not necessarily on one side of the fence completely, but certain things like the ones you brought up do raise my eyebrows. Also, the things like the phone call with Nixon, just that vehicle they have, what it is, what it's made of, the size of it compared to what they came in. There's some stuff
Cosmic
there.
Radiation problems.
The Van Allen belt, the radiation,
sort of stuff, and that, you know,
the brightness, like, you know, I don't, you know, but then there's stuff that I wasn't there as well. I don't know all this stuff. You know, is it supposed to be brighter? Are you closer to the sun? Are you at an angle that you're supposed to get more heat or more sun? Maybe yes. I don't know. Okay, we can let that one fly. But it's a situation where there's so many things that, like,
a lot of people have said, you know, why couldn't you see the stars?
Okay. Yes, there's another one.
Right.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
And you know, the accepted reason for that, from a photography point of view,
right,
is exposure to the sun's actual. You're on the side where you're exposed to the sun,
right, and
such. It would block out stars because we only see stars because of refraction through our atmosphere. But the fact is that the same refraction would happen through a lens of a camera.
Okay.
All right. As to our naked eye when we see stars at the top. So it still is one of those things that somebody could explain away, you know, as as an idea. But the other ones that I sort of brought up are the ones that, having had experience with photography and how it works, it's the framing one that I just keep coming back to. It's a little bit like who told, you know, why on the day when 4 737, 727 type aircraft are hijacked, did the entire United States Air Force stand down for over an hour, you know, during the 9/11 stuff and such.
Yep.
You know, whereas a couple of years before, or maybe a few months before, Payne Stewart died of asphyxiation in the cockpit of his jet along with 5 other people. They had F-16s on his wing within 15 minutes, you know, from the transponder not replying. They had these airplanes flying around for an hour without any response from the Air Force during 9/11. So that's the thing that has never been adequately explained to me about 9/11. You've got to explain that. They put all of these protocols in place because of the Arab hijackings through the 1970s. They were in place. They were there when Payne Stewart's aircraft stopped, and they followed it right out into the Atlantic, I think it was, when he ran out of fuel and it dived into the ocean and so on. And they were going to shoot it down if it threatened any city and so on, because they had verified everybody was dead in the cockpit. You know, why on the day when 4 major airliners get, you know, have this? And this is how I approach the moon stuff. I also do wonder about Kubrick's seeming ability to arrange financing and support from the studios for all his films, that legendary control was not just the artistic control, but also the budget, the backing, the financial backing, all that kind of stuff. And Widener, throws shade that way onto the, onto the cause, saying that he just simply had this blackmailable position. You give me what I want, and I won't say what, that I faked the moon landings.
Okay.
That was always his concept around that idea. It was his special effects ability from Dr. Strangelove that apparently sold. He was a special effects master.
Yeah, and I think the inside, just how good of a job you did on the inside of the bomber as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's funny. Have you seen Failsafe, the more serious version of Dr. Strangelove? I
haven't. No.
It's Henry Fonda, a bunch of other great names, Edmund O'Brien, some others. It's essentially the serious version. It's based off the same book. It's essentially the same story essentially.
Right.
But if you compare the bomber scenes, you could tell that like one has Kubrick's. One looks like you're in a bomber, and one looks like you're trying to make it look like you're almost looking like kind of like you're in a similar looking bond, but it's
like
so
the
it's
famous
interesting
Hollywood driving scenes where they're talking like that for the whole shot.
Exactly, exactly, man. Exactly. So it's interesting. It's interesting. They're both great movies, by the way, just throwing that out there, and they're interesting to watch just to see if you want to compare essentially the same story and whatnot. A Kubrick to I think Sidney Lumet or whatever does it. But they're both great movies, but it's just an interesting how much detail.
Didn't Sidney Lumet have a role in Eyes Wide Shut? Did he? Was there anything with him, or am I thinking of? I'm thinking of Sidney Pollack. Okay. That's who I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Okay. Since we're talking about, since you brought him up, Sidney Pollack, I could just be getting myself confused because I'm pulling this from a while back. And I could be just getting Roman Polanski. I know the names aren't that similar, but I could just be getting things confused. Is there anything with Sidney Pollack with regards to him, like, being a shady guy, or just, anything related to sexual abuse or that kind of can of worms? I almost feel like there is.
Yeah.
But I don't want to jump the line until,
He's dead now, Sidney Pollack. Okay. But I do seem to remember something like that.
Okay.
I mean, if you mention, if you bring up Polanski, there is a serious can of worms. In terms of Hollywood history.
And I was when you were talking about, I forget I think you were talking about maybe when we were talking about Ryan O'Neal, or we were talking about a different actor, whether or not maybe they were involved. But I was going to bring up, when I brought up Ryan O'Neal, I was also going to bring up Jack Nicholson, because there is now that we've brought up Roman Polanski, we've gone full circle. So there is the story where I think it's the case that caused him to flee.
13-year-old girl sodomized
after Angelica Houston's house while she was with Jack Nicholson. It sounded like, based on everything I've heard, it sounds like Jack may not have been in town, but he wasn't. Okay. So, but and it sounds like, I still don't know whether or not Angelica Houston is, what her involvement is, if it was just, but the fact of the matter remains is that when it was all brought into the light, so to speak, I think it was around the time of The Pianist, they all fucking stood up and gave that piece of garbage standing ovation. So let's not forget that. And so I always just try to be
people
careful
forget
with
this. Polanski was actually convicted. Polanski was actually convicted.
Exactly.
A lot of people, they didn't sort of run away, and so it was never proved. All right.
Yeah. No, he ran away because he's
convicted.
running away from something. Yeah.
And the context of it, all right, is that the crime he committed is well within that period when he was should have been supposedly mourning the death of his pregnant wife at the hands of Manson's gang, the Manson family, and all that sort of thing. And I'm of the opinion that that Polanski was actually the target of the Manson killings.
I have. That's definitely something to sure.
So the LaBianca family that got murdered, all right, in Little Armenia, a couple of days later or a week, I can't remember what the timelines are or whatever, but they're linked in that it's the same group of guys that Manson sent on these sort of jobs. So you get the Tate killing in the Laurel Canyon, down at, the mouth of Laurel Canyon. But then you go over to Little Armenia and do you know Los Angeles geography?
Maybe your like mainstream knowledge of it, your basic knowledge of
Hollywood's kind of like between, where Sharon Tate was killed and where the LaBianca family. And the LaBianca family were killed pure, utter example of mistaken identity.
Okay.
All right. It was a group of drug dealers that Manson was offside who were living in the house next to the LaBiancas. Manson went up, scoped the place, came down, told the guys, go up there and kill him. They're in this house, and they went to the wrong house. All right. So the LaBiancas are a classic example of people being caught up as innocents in a very dodgy sort of situation. But my understanding is that the original sort of emphasis on what was going on, if you remember the whole aspect about the Manson family and Manson himself, what did he do? He auditioned as one of the monkeys.
Yeah.
He wanted to be banned. By all accounts, he was a pretty good musician and a good sort of a songwriter, by even the standards of Neil Young comments on it, that he had the chops to make it as a musician song, but he was living on a movie ranch with his family, literally on the other side of the mountains from Laurel Canyon and such. And so you've got that whole sort of Hollywood film connection and so on. And of course, we know that Manson was a victim of the drug experiments, the LSD experiments that were taking place in American prisons and so on. And he himself had a very bizarre upbringing, was sent to school in a girl's dress because his stepfather or something like that said he was too much of a pussy to wear, boys' clothing and so on like that. So you've got a totally messed up individual. But from what I understand, and I take this out of the understanding that Dave McGowan gives in his book, Laurel Canyon and Program to Kill, his books along those lines, I recommend anybody, if you want to understand the sheer psychopathy of the Los Angeles side of things and the Hollywood side of things, those are two books to start off with. They're second to none. He intimates that film footage was taken at some of these drug orgies that took place in the canyon, and that the guy who was involved in a lot of this filming behind, without people knowing, sex orgies, that kind of stuff, was Polanski. And that there might have been blackmailable material that people were trying to get back, and things got out of control linked in with the drugs. Now, here's another aspect that a lot of people have not picked up. Angelica Houston is the daughter of John Huston, another great film director. John Huston had a fantastically close relationship with George Hodel. George Hodel was a doctor of venereal disease who had the inside track on whoever was having to be cured of whatever venereal disease, plus who was arranging illegal abortions in the Hollywood scene, as in the elites and all that. So he had a lot of blackmail stuff. Now, George Hodel's son, who would later on become a very successful homicide cop himself, he can't write this stuff, but it's true, Steve Hodel, wrote his book about the Black Dahlia killing, where he claims his father is the guy who killed the Black Dahlia in 1947 and such. And in that, he intimates that John Huston knew that George Hodel was responsible for it, and that in his films Chinatown, which is a Roman Polanski
yep, and Jack
type,
Nicholson.
And Jack Nicholson, and so on. The emphasis there is that really John Huston is playing the role of George Hodel, and Faye Dunaway is playing the role of Tamara Hodel, who is George Hodel's daughter, who he had this kind of incestual relationship going with, that is in the film Chinatown. All right.
Okay.
And then you get the Clint Eastwood film, what's it called? White Hunter, Black Heart.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
And it's a film about the obsession of John Huston when he basically contrived the African Queen movie so he could get to Africa and shoot an elephant and such, right? And he becomes his obsession through it to kill an elephant. But there is a part in that film where the director, Clint Eastwood, is playing kind of the quasi role of John Huston. It's not John Huston himself, it's not biopic, but you can read between the lines there. And he says in the film, what if your best friend came to you one night and confessed an act so heinous, so deplorable, what would you do? In other words, if I'm going from memory, and I think it's something along, is that not the ultimate test of friendship that one could ever have? And it's a strange line to put in that film. It's a strange line, and it's apparently taken from the guy who wrote White Heart, Black Hunter. He wrote the screenplay of African Queen.
Okay.
Song. All right, okay. And he sort of drops this sort of like comment from nowhere. They're in Africa doing all this. Why is John Huston talking about what would happen if your best friend turned up, all right, and said he'd committed a heinous act? Would that not be the ultimate test of friendship? Why? What's the context for that? And the only context is that John Huston married George Hodell's wife after she divorced George Hodell. There was this almost incestuous type pattern between the Hodells and the Hustons in terms of how they live. Now, if George Hodell is in fact the Black Dahlia killer, and John Huston helped him get out of that situation, gave him, money to get out, and Steve Hodell does this incredible story of showing that George Sexton, I think it is. All right, George Sexton is the guy who designed the mold that played a role in John Huston's probably one of his most famous films, The Maltese Falcon.
Yeah.
That famous prop that gets broken, and it's what's inside the falcon that's valuable, and so on like that. Why does everybody want to get this, this thing about the falcon?
Right.
That was George Sexton. And according to Steve Hodell, the murder of the Black Dahlia was his father's action, but he did it in cahoots with at least one man and one woman at the time. And he's always intimated that Sexton was the man who was involved helping him get the body out to the street where the Dahlia was found and so on like that. But anyway, that's an entirely a story in its own, discussing Hodell's theories about his father and the Black Dahlia killing and the John Huston connections and so on like that.
So sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. So I have it pulled up here if you want me to read it real quick.
Sure.
Okay. So from White Hunter, Blackheart. No, it's not. To try to find out who your real friends are is very important. How would you propose to go about doing that, John? Well, I don't know. It's kind of difficult. I think the perfect test would be to go to your friends and tell them you've just committed a murder, a cold-blooded, premeditated murder, and that you want to escape. There are no extenuating circumstances. All you want is help. The people who'd stick to you and help you escape without asking any questions would, I believe, qualify as real friends.
Yeah. And that's right. And in context of what Steve Hodell was saying about that, because there were people like the surrealist artist Ray Mann, other people sort of involved in that circle of surrealist types with George Hodell, who believed himself to be an artist but never was the type. So effectively, hey, you guys paint pictures of, bisected women and amputated women and so on. I do it for real. You do paintings, I do meat sculptures.
Yeah.
And this would have freaked these guys out beyond belief. And it's not only have you got a friend there, but if he's willing to sort of murder on that level, there is the long-term effect of helping somebody out like that out. Do they come back when what happens and so on? There's that fear aspect about it. And I think to a large degree, Chinatown was one of those films that exposed what might have been going on in Hollywood 1946 to 1948. And, in terms of, by one of the great Hollywood directors, in his own right. But it's a fascinating story that links in Polanski, because Polanski did that film with John Huston, with Jack Nicholson, staying at Jack Nicholson's place and sodomizing that 13-year-old girl, doing all these sorts of things. These people are so degenerate, so decadent, in their morals and all that sort of stuff, that they have to stick together. They have to believe that their friendship would allow them to call upon the help of other people. And that's exactly what Hollywood has done. If you take that quote there, which I was sort of looking at from memory, that's exactly what Hollywood did when it clapped Polanski, knowing he'd sodomized a 13-year-old girl after plying her with drugs. I think he drugs and alcohol. And so
yes,
they stood up and said, you're still our friend and we will help you get back. And by the way, here's an award. This will help you get more money to make more films where you live and all that,
Yeah. Exactly. It's like you're at a disadvantage or you're at a handicap because you're cut off from here. So, here's an award. Exactly. This will help you out.
Because that's Academy Awards are that. They're financing devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just finishing a book on Walt Disney, and that comes up so many times where he's essentially, either the studio is about to go bankrupt or he's just in a slump or he needs some, and you'll put something out, it gets an award, all of a sudden the bank is just, and then there was that communist aspect where he was put on a pedestal as this American patriot, so that and the Red Scare got so ridiculous that it's like, okay, well, if you're not going to finance his movie, as the person at the bank, if you're not going to approve the financing, you're doing something against the patriot. You're doing something unpatriotic. You might get in the black book, that whole black book thing, right? So that's just, absolutely.
Well, the Disney can of worms that's there to be explored. We all know the symbolism that they stuck into those films, subliminal stuff and along those lines. But it was an open secret that Disney himself was a pederast, and it boggles the mind. And yet at the same time, this culture of influence as opposed to merit is what drives this whole sort of deal, so that great actors who won't compromise themselves, who won't allow situations that can be used to blackmail them to occur, and so on, never make it. And we've been robbed in terms of our artistic culture of some great people who wouldn't play the game, would not be involved. The examples throughout Hollywood are phenomenal. It's got worse. Some of the stuff coming out of the hip hop genre and in the music side of Hollywood and so on like that, shows how bad, if what these guys are saying is true about how you make it in the music world.
Yeah.
And so, and if what they're saying is true about it, anybody who wants to adhere to certain morals and principles is going to have the toughest time
find a new
making
job,
a career.
Find a new career.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's super sad. So it's it's just, to an extent, it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah,
and it's no wonder that there's just so much junk that gets pushed out these days.
Well, take our conversation the last 20 minutes, how we leapt from Kubrick to moon landings that took us into the Polanski milieu, that leads us into Jack Nicholson, Angelica Houston, to her father, to the killing of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, Dahlia, as some people like to say. But, which is truly one of the most horrifying examples of ritualistic murder that you'll ever see. The only thing that I can say about Elizabeth Short is that most of the stuff done to her was done after she was dead.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Okay. But she died a horrific death. And, I strongly suggest, if anybody wants to understand how the world of art has been corrupted, not only by money interests, but by people who have these occult sort of backgrounds and so on, because, we can talk about the effed up rock stars on their heroin and so on.
Yep.
But artists of the painting genre and sculpture and the literature, these guys were doing this in the 1920s, as bad as any excesses you hear from, the rock stars of the 70s and onwards. And that the stuff in the 1920s was coming through in terms of the art of that time. And so I would say anybody who wants to understand why the Black Dahlia killing is probably the most important murder to understand in understanding what Hollywood and our entertainment is, get a book called Exquisite Corpse. It's a study of the entire surrealist movement and how it seemed to fetishize the idea of dismembering the female form, in all sorts of ways as part of its movement, as part of its school of artistic thought, and so on. So the Exquisite Corpse sort of shows you the surrealist symbolism that is massively involved in the Black Dahlia killing and other killings of the time and such, all right, that can be linked back to the surrealists. And again, without sort of being overt about my book, if you understand Saturn symbology, particularly when it comes to the Minotaur and the destruction of maids, the maidens, which the Minotaur was. You sacrificed your virgins to the Minotaur down in the labyrinth, and that's become the great symbol that we go through life, this labyrinth of life, trying to avoid violence. But at some point, most of us will turn that corner and something shocking will happen to us in this world that we exist in. That's the modern interpretation of the Minotaur story, Theseus and the Minotaur and such. But the Minotaur is simply a derivation of the Saturnian horned god and the symbolism that comes out of that mythology. And hopefully if somebody reads my book, you're liberated from being triggered by these symbols and see it for what it is. But those surrealists leading up to people who were their groupies like George Hodel, who wanted to make some kind of artistic, intellectual statement with the murder of George Hodel, is, what I believe has been said about the killing. It just shows you that that whole Hollywood, California, even going up to San Francisco is linked to, but particularly California, Hollywood, Laurel Canyon, has been such a negative influence over our artistic development as a society, since the 1920s, that bring it full circle, Jordan. It's no wonder Kubrick wanted to get away from it and live in England.
Absolutely. And just being the particular sort of person he seemed to be, it's absolutely no wonder that he wanted to get away from that. And it's funny when some of the things that people say about him is just ridiculous. Like when the people that say that he's, he hates on women and he's abusive to women or rude to women. And it's like, I mean, he shows so much love for his family, and you can see that. And I think that's also a big piece. He just wanted to get his family away from that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So,
and I think if you subscribe to what we've been putting out in this discussion, that Kubrick was trying to tell us, hey man, this Hollywood is it's a pedophile, it's a factory. It's a factory, a pedophile factory for destroying young lives, through the glamour of supposedly what Hollywood is. It's nothing like that, And again, so the last words in the Vigilant Citizen article, our civilization as a whole still has its eyes wide shut. And those were Kubrick's last cinematographic words, in terms of what he left us with as a legacy. That's not somebody who hates humanity, who hates women, that's somebody who actually is trying to tell it as it is without himself becoming a statistic of some sort of Hollywood overdose or strange suicide that so many of these people seem to succumb to, without going into the territory of the star whackers, a la, what's his name, a comedian guy, Randy. Anyway,
I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, his brother and him are quite estranged.
Okay.
And such, but he did a few big movies in his time in there. But remember, he went totally crazy at about the turn of the early 2000s. He started talking about the Hollywood whackers who, sort of engineered people's. If you do a search in Hollywood whackers, you'll see his name, Randy something. And he just had the idea that people that when famously rich actors.
Oh, Randy Quaid.
Yes,
yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I should have known that. I
remember all his stuff.
He's Canadian. Yeah, I should have known.
Yeah, right. Okay. I didn't know that. The Quaids are Canadian, are they?
Yep.
Yeah, add that to the list.
He is.
I'm amazed at how many Canadians, crypto Canadians are running around in the Hollywood film, industry and so on. I've been absolutely, boggled, from William Shatner to Jim Carrey to Michael J. Fox to,
Sorry, my mistake. He fled to Canada. During all that stuff. I'm sorry.
Right.
Correction. He is American.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But your point still stands. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think he had a nervous breakdown.
Oh, absolutely. Because he just let he had a bit of a mental
there does
change.
Seem to be something there. Dave McGowan stuff, Laurel Canyon, the amount of these people who end up as either suicides or strange deaths that are linked into, the Laurel Canyon scene and the music side of stuff. And then you've got that whole connection to that government, Air Force, and ultimately CIA operated film studio at the top of Laurel Canyon. I think, what's his name? Is it Jared Leto, the actor who now owns it?
Yes.
And he's not found any of the secret sort of rooms that people said were up there. But as I said, it was the most complete actual film studio in Hollywood for something like 30 years. They had all the facilities, but nobody was making actual Hollywood films up there. It was a quite the complex in its time. But Dave McGowan links that into the controlled opposition idea of, let's stop the anti-war movement, of which Kubrick was a major part of before, but gained by the 1960s with the Vietnam conflict. Let's stop the anti-war effort by controlling the people, the singers and everybody like that, who people look to, for the hippie generation, and so on like that. So they hijacked the Haight-Ashbury sort of scene from San Francisco. And, we were stuck with, the Mamas and the Papas and the Birds and the all these sorts of, the Doors and Neil Young, Crosby, Stills, Young and Nash, and, all these guys became the face of that anti-war movement. And it seems nothing could be further from the truth, and effectively discredited it because of their promotion of drug taking and so on.
Right.
So, that's Dave McGowan's thesis.
Okay.
In the Laurel Canyon, and I fully subscribe to it. And I think Kubrick had an idea that these things were going on.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I don't know, just again with like knowing who to trust and who's into what, you have no idea. Like when it comes to Spielberg, I've heard some kind of sketchy stuff. I don't know. I think maybe I'm leaning a lot on the Epstein thing, him being on the Epstein flights, I believe, and his name popping up with relations to that, which is interesting because in Eyes Wide Shut, I think the whole Epstein related theme of trafficking and blackmail is heavily,
very much so,
in
the
Eyes
fact
Wide
it's centered
Shut.
in New York and not California tells you that
blackmail room that Milich has, and just with the pizza and his daughter, and it's the locks on the outside of the door. It's ridiculous how he's calling this stuff. And
look at what Hollywood is telling us about Spielberg as well. Family Guy, that kind of stuff. These are the same shows that told us that Kevin Spacey was doing his stuff in the thing, and at the same time they were telling us, it's like when the kid escapes from a basement room, and they openly say, "Oh, he escaped from Steven Spielberg."
Right.
In the basement room. There's an old saying: don't look at what they say, look at what they do. All right. And with Spielberg, his student film, all right, that he put out that got him all of the connections. It's about the girl who goes to the beach.
Okay.
I forget what it's called or whatever like that. But it has very, very strong pedophile insinuations about what's going on there from a homosexual point of view, despite the fact that the main protagonist in the film is a young girl that is carrying on there. And it's soon after those films that Spielberg himself starts getting an open check to, he does Jewel, and then Jaws becomes his next, sort of big scene. But it's when, with Spielberg, it's when we start to see some of the dialogue in the Indiana Jones film. You know the part I'm talking about.
I think so.
Indiana Jones, how could, confronted by some young woman who says, "How could you do that to me? I was only a child then." And they're obviously talking about romantic stuff.
Yes. Right? Okay. Oh my God. Yes.
Yeah. All right. And they've tried to explain that, but if you look at the context, is that we're talking about a girl who would have been between 9 and 12 in the terms of it. And that's George Lucas and Spielberg writing that kind of script into, almost playing games. Hey, let's see what we can get away with.
Oh man, yeah.
And then the creepiest thing that Spielberg has ever put to film is Robin Williams as Peter Pan.
Oh, Jesus.
The epitome of the middle-aged bear.
Yeah. Holy.
And that whole scene where they are stroking his naked torso and literally they're running their hands over him and so on like that. I saw that film when it came out. I would have been my early 20s at the time when Hook came out. And, I was interested because I wanted to see Dustin Hoffman as Captain Hook. Right. I thought that was going to be a great sort of a thing. I was always liked Dustin Hoffman as an actor.
Yes.
And so I went to see it, and the Peter Pan thing, I just couldn't believe how, I thought they were going to transform him into a young boy as one of the gang and that, but they kept him as this middle-aged, hairy guy.
Yeah.
And it just had, apart from some of the innuendo that was thrown Tinkerbell's way, played by Julia Roberts, and so on, which today would quite simply be construed as sexual harassment.
Okay.
It was the way the Lost Boys, again, kids that never grow up. Another theme, a theme that Spielberg explored in Hook as much as he did in AI. All right. So the Lost Boys never grow up. Okay. And their meeting with Peter Pan, his old buddies, is this. At the time, I remember sitting in the theater thinking, what the hell's this? Why would they want to go and run their hands over his naked torso? And so on, along those lines. If I met my old friends from school and such, I'd be outraged if they started pawing me, right, and so on like that. And I doubt that they would want to do that. But here in the film, for some reason, Spielberg used that to portray the relationship of the Lost Boys with the middle-aged, hairy bear bloke, as part of the thing. And to me, that was just one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in mainstream cinema.
Jeez, I don't remember that at all. I'll have to go back and check that out. But yeah, that's just the fact that he's the age thing alone. It's just
he's a naked, hairy guy, and all these 12-year-old, 9-year-old boys start stroking him. And I thought, oh my God, that as I grew older and even got more, it's a pedophile's wet dream, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
That's what it ultimately ends up looking like. So Spielberg has that as his thing. I defy anybody to find anything remotely like that in Kubrick's films where it's portrayed positively.
Yeah, exactly.
Even,
Fair enough. Yeah, true enough. And then I think there's some, I don't know if it's just more recently, the stuff that came out about Dustin Hoffman, 3-ish years ago now, but there's been stuff about him and, just the name of the movie. I get that it's, Captain Hook, but, Hook, we're hooking kids or whatever, it's just.
Yeah. And then you got to look at the fallout between Jackson and Spielberg, because Jackson wanted to play the role of Pan. Michael Jackson and so on like that. And
yes.
And that's why he named his ranch Neverland.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to the Lost Boys and the fact of the matter, the guy Barry who wrote Peter Pan, he's been outed as a pedophile. His whole thing was he based his Wendy character on the daughter of of his associate and so on like that. And he got into a very unhealthy, relationship with her, correspondence relationship that has been exposed. He was a pedophile, pure and simple. He wrote Peter Pan. It's a story about boys who never grow up, put two and two together.
Being taken away, essentially.
Exactly.
To another world.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, again, this is, what Kubrick, the constant use, the Vigilant Citizen article talks about the use of the rainbow imagery in the Eyes Wide Shut. Okay, that has that. And it's this idea that a rainbow, at the end of the rainbow, is a pot of gold, the Yellow Brick Road and the Wizard of Oz film from the 1930s, which has all kinds of, shocking revelations of what was going on set to young Judy Garland.
Yes.
At that time. And, the rainbow is this sort of key into another world where the moral values that keep us in place in this world no longer apply. And, this is what Hollywood represents. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for so many young kids who think that's what they want in life, that they're going to, get that kind of fame and security. Yeah, I understand it, because I got into the film world thinking Hollywood was the greatest thing to be involved in. I never went to Hollywood. I visited it a couple of times. I never got involved in it, but I went to the Hong Kong film industry and things like that. And for some reason, I just lost this thing about Hollywood, I don't know why it just no longer became the lure that it was in the younger days. I think I began to understand that filmmaking and Hollywood is a very different thing, two very different ideas. And but unfortunately, because money is involved, Hollywood has become the byword for where you go to get involved. And the younger you are, the more likely you're going to be sucked up into this thing that, chews you up, uses you, and spits you out later on.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Too many examples of people who've gone down that route.
Yeah, exactly. And just to that point, I think like Disney is an example of like a sub factory on their own.
It keeps coming back to them, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. Absolutely.
Whether it's Britney Spears or the films put out in the 30s,
yeah,
and so on with its imagery and such. The first inclination I got this was when hardcore pornography was legalized in New Zealand, where I grew up, and so on. And I remember reading an article that said a lot of people don't realize that Disney is one of the largest creators of pornography in America, in the sense that they were fully invested in a porn factory. What they call it,
yes.
The valley out there, the Vezeau Valley.
Yeah.
They were major backers in some of the in the golden age of pornography, or just after the home video revolution. The golden age of pornography, you had to pay money to go to some cinema and sit and hope nobody saw you go in, and all this sort of stuff that was happening, and Times Square sort of stuff and that. But Disney got involved during the home video revolution that started to come into effect in the mid 80s, when you could hire movies, take them home, and play them on a video machine. You didn't have to have a projector and so on. They were heavily involved with some production company that was churning out porn.
Okay. There's just another, because we're talking about Disney, and there's another Nickelodeon. They used to be called Nickelodeons, I think, where you'd go in and you'd pay your quarter or whatever, and you'd do your thing. And then you look at look at Nickelodeon and all the stuff that's going on with that.
Yeah. I consider myself pretty well read, pretty well experienced on what is out there. And so I remember a cop when I was working in television. They had a show in New Zealand that I worked on a couple of times called Fair Go, where we worked with police going after fraudsters, and stuff like that. But I got talking to one of the cops on the thing, and I was young and brash at the time. I said, "Is there any truth to this thing about snuff porn and such?" All right, because it had something to do. I can't remember the exact details, but it had something to do with porn coming into the country, into New Zealand, and so on like that. And I'll never forget his answer. His answer was, if you can imagine it, they're doing it.
Okay.
And, okay, your imagination can go places, even for somebody who's not of that way. And it's a terrifying thought. And, so that was as far as he was willing to sort of go on it. Obviously, being a cop, he couldn't divulge certain things or whatever. But it's just one of those things that media, the advent of the video camera and the domestic recordable devices, even the days of the high 8 and so on like that.
Okay.
8mm. I'm sorry, not high 8. That's video, but the 8mm sort of stuff and that. We probably don't know a tenth of what was going on even back in those days. I'm convinced that there is an underground market for stuff that serial killers have sold, what they've done into that market.
Okay.
And a lot of it has not been discovered. We had a particularly loathsome guy called West. I want to say George West, but it wasn't. It was Rosemary West was his wife. And anyway, his name was West. And he was a serial killer in Gloucester, England, who murdered young girls in the basement, a la John Wayne Gacy style and so on like that, including his own daughters and things like that. He was a particularly horrific person. And what came out of the original stuff, and often it's the original reports that you get the truth about what's going on, was he had filmed a lot of the stuff. But none of it was ever presented as evidence. None of it was ever, and it was the idea that somehow he was selling it into a ring in Gloucester. Now, what that tells you is that they caught him. He went to jail and mysteriously died of suicide before coming to trial. All right. But if that is true from the original reports that he was recording stuff and selling it into a ring of people, there was a ring of people in Gloucester at that time who have never been caught,
right,
who have been dealing in this kind of stuff. And they probably still exist to this day. It was the same down in Cardiff and over in Amsterdam. You know, it talks about this, the stuff that was available and such. And, you know, the crossover between that industry and what people would call the mainstream industry and so on, it's a little bit like the almost obvious crossover between drugs, arms dealing, sex trafficking, and so on, and the major mainstream banks. Okay. How can you have a $700 billion a year illicit drug industry, which is probably worth more, and not have the banks involved when that kind of money is being dealt? You know, nobody creates an industry that runs on deals to the tune of $700 billion by going to meetings with briefcases full of cash. You just can't do it. It's logistically and physically impossible to deal in that kind of money and not have the help of the banks doing it. But nobody sits down, hey, why are we allowing the banks to facilitate an industry that's highly illegal? Well, it's the same thing going on in distribution of snuff porn.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, yeah, there's, like you said, we don't know all of it. We only know whatever percentage you said. And to the other point of, I mean, some people just imagine or attempt to do some pretty horrific things or ridiculous things. So, I mean, it's just a matter of getting a few like-minded people to connect, which obviously with the internet and whatnot is a lot easier.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, so. I'm actually, despite everything we're talking about, I'm actually highly optimistic about where we're going in the world. Whereas other people see us degenerating into a dystopian, future where, the Saturn death cult, runs things from behind the scenes and you have no chance. I actually believe the opposite is taking place.
Okay.
And I think that's because the internet, rather than creating a world culture, is actually facilitating diversity of culture that they can't control, that they can't see. The whole objective has always been watch these kinds of movies, watch this kind of entertainment, follow this kind of moral thinking, from our spokespeople who tell you this and so on like that. They've lost total control of that. The fact you and I are talking about it, and you're over in Canada, I'm here in Britain, and so on. We've only know each other through connections on the internet. We can have this massive discussion. When I was growing up, I would never have known you were alive and you wouldn't have known I was alive.
Exactly.
Even if we held the same views about the things that were interested to us, you just didn't have the capacity to connect with people. It was always at a totally local level. And now I can sell a book, on the internet that reaches people in countries as diverse as India to Japan to Brazil. I'm getting a lot of sales on this topic from non-English speaking countries. Okay. And it's because the internet has put me in contact with these people. And I'm sure that if the people I talk about, the influences of our society that have had control, had it their way, they would have stopped me, and they would have. There's no way the book I wrote could ever have been published by a publishing house, back in the day before the internet. It just wouldn't have happened. And such, they would never have allowed that to take place. If suddenly I made 50,000 sales over the next month of my book and it became all the rage, I think then they'd take notice and try to, say, hey, look, this guy's got some of the weirdest stuff out. He's misinformation, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure that would happen. But I'm not worried about that, because it's the little stuff like this that is reaching a couple of thousand people here, there, that is changing the world away from these people and their dominance of the narrative and such,
Sure.
And it's a fantastic time to be alive. The only other time in history was the advent of the Gutenberg printing press.
Okay.
You have to go back to that because that's what broke the domination of the Catholic Church. It wasn't the theology of John Knox and Luther and all these guys doing their preaching from pulpits. All right. What broke the dominance of the Catholic Church was that they could print up their sermons and that could be distributed, over a wide range. Well, the internet is far beyond that. And now, we're all able to discuss these things. A lot of people say what you and I discussed tonight, 90% of it is crap.
Sure.
They would say that and such and so on. But even that 10% is now in their mind if they listen to what we're saying, that they can work on, that they can take away and meditate on. In the old days, they would never even heard that 10%.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, yeah, so just to pull it back real quickly. So would you generally say that the benefits will absolutely outweigh the detriments or the negative that has come from this ability to connect and,
Yeah. Yeah, and people are going to find it strange because as I say, the dead horse that I flog is the idea that the root of all evil is the love of money, not the love of the devil or an occult being or anything like that. It's the love of money, and that is personified in the central banking, international debt-based financial system that we all slave under. In terms of what's called national debt and all this sort of stuff. It's get rid of that and start again with sound money, with money that is not issued as a debt in the first place to make the people issuing it rich on your productivity. I mean, let's face it, the way the central bank in its purest form works is I'm going to give you $10 and you can use that to create your little community, but it's the only $10 in the world. At the end of the year, I want 11 back. And if I don't get that $11th, I get to get all your stuff for me. It belongs to me. All right, you can't pay that $11th back. It doesn't exist. And that's not how they work over long term. They will lend you that extra dollar, but at, for 10 cents. And that's where national debt comes up and it comes into the picture. It drives us all down to a level where somebody, no matter how, if we all work and we all work hard and we all work smart, at the end of the year, somebody always loses. And each year that size gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the banks have worked out that when it gets to a certain level, crash the system, start again and say, hey, here's my system. I'll lend you $10, but you've got to give me 11 back and we'll start the whole thing again. At the beginning, it seems wonderful for the guys, for the 99% who do well and get well. It's great. Next year, it's only 95%. Then the year after that, 90%. And there's this growing amount of people. And then they crash the system again. They've been doing this, at least in the modern world, since the great South Seas bubble and such like that. But I would argue it's a process that has been continued since the days of the city of Babylon. All right, so we're talking from 600 BC right up to the modern age with the capture of America under the Federal Reserve System, right up to the day that we're in. This system has been perpetuated in one way or another, based on gold, based on fiat, based on all this, but always based on interest and such, right? Now, what's the one thing that is destroying their ability to run a system in the world where they have total control over who gets money, who gets issued the money? That is the internet and the advent of cryptocurrencies. The blockchain.
Okay.
Such,
yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Okay. They talk about central banking, digital currencies, and so on like that, and they say we're going to do this and we're going to operate that. But what they're doing is they're operating still a centralized system. Cryptocurrency is so dangerous to them because it is completely and utterly decentralized. You and I can do a deal in cryptocurrencies, and the banks will never know about it, don't need to know about it or anything. The only time we need a third person is if you and I get into a dispute.
Yeah.
But if I'm happy with the product you sold me and you're happy with the digital currency I gave you, Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever it is, then we're happy. And guess what? We're being productive and nobody has a claim on that productivity. You've done a deal with me that you're happy with. I've got stuff from you that I'm happy with. We're all happy. If you sell me something, it's like, hey, you told me this was going to be a book with 200 pages of text or something like that. I've only got 140 and so on. You've ripped me off 60 pages or whatever like that. You can get a third person involved to do the dispute between those two. And then it's judged on the measures that we've engaged in using cryptocurrency and so on like that. But once again, it's just you, me, and the third person who judges between us. And, we come down to a settlement. In terms of actual intractable settlements where somebody is a criminal, is purposely ripping off somebody, you just never deal with them again, and word gets out and such over the internet and such. So it becomes a system that the governments can't control. They can't say, you can deal with this person, but not this person. We'll decide that. And that's true freedom. And that has not been the case in Western society since the days of Babylon.
Wow.
Very exciting times.
Yeah, stretches back. Yeah, man. That's wild. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, the biblical account, the book of Daniel, and so I argue in the book, all right, everybody sees this as a quaint story. And the Babylonian king sticks up a golden statue, all right, and says everybody's got to bow down to it and worship it. And 3 Judahite kids, Jews, decide they're not going to. They worship their God, and so you're going to be stuck in the furnace, and you have all that story about surviving the furnace and so on. But what you've got in that story is you've got a story of the first gold standard in financial history. Okay, and the bowing down to that particular golden statue means that you will operate according to the gold standard economic system that Babylon was putting around. In other words, they were issuing money against gold-backed stuff, which allowed them to run what's called the fractional reserve scam. Well, I've got an ounce of gold, I'll issue $1. Hey, I can get away with issuing $5. Hey, I can get away with issuing $35. And then you've got 35 people claiming that 1 ounce. When you get to the stage where you're, 200 to 1 ounce, and even 5 people come back and say, I'd like to have my ounce of gold, your system collapses. Right? And that's why it goes boom bust all the way to time. And that's why the Israelite kids that were involved in that time said, we're not involved in anything that's being involved that is against the laws of God. And this is the financial aspect of the biblical finance versus the Babylonian finance. But here's the interesting thing about where the Bible takes all of that for people who don't want to necessarily get involved in the whole religious aspect of it, just what is being reported here. And that is that in the book of Revelation, everybody's obsessed about this idea of 666.
Yeah.
This concept of a mark being put on your forehead and your forearm, and you can't buy or sell unless you take that mark. All right. And people think this is something that's going to happen in the future, and they're worried about biometric chips being put in us and so on, so they can control us. Well, believe you me, they've controlled us with money, because the forearm is symbolic of manual labor and the forehead is symbolic of intellectual labor, which is simply white collar and blue collar labor. All right. The 2 variants that people make their money on is in the forehand and with the forehead. But what's the 666 number? All right. 6 is the number of man. He's made on the 6th day. The symbolism is there. 666, 3 has a spiritual element to it. But where do you see the 666 number where we are told it is the number of a man somewhere else in the Bible? I ask this of many Christians, many people who whatever, and they can't think of it. They don't know where they see it. Do you know where you see it?
Oh, I have no idea.
You see it in the measurements of the gold statue that was put up in Babylon. It is 666 cubits high.
Wow. Okay.
All right. So all you're talking about, rather than some grotesque antichrist turning up, Damien Thorne from, what are those films called, The Omen and all that sort of stuff. That idea of some grotesque individual who's going to turn up and say, right, you get a tattoo or you get a chip stuck in your arm, you can't do anything unless I say it, and so on like that. What it's telling us is that the man-made system created, the financial man-made system that was first formulated and has been refined down through the age in Babylon, is that system that is going to plague us until the end of time, unless, there is a change in the way people, and of course, what the Bible offers is this idea, that ultimately you're redeemed out of it and God saves you, the Messiah complex sort of idea. But it is that financial aspect that you can't buy or sell unless you operate within whatever government's man-made financial system is on offer, gold-backed, and ultimately refined down to what I call the central banking model.
Okay.
All right. And, you know, we've all taken the marks philosophically. I've spent my whole life either making money painting people's roofs, it's my forearm,
Okay.
or editing videos for people, you know, in a newsroom or whatever it is that I've done, which is my intellectual labor, in order to pay my rent, in order to meet my bills. And there's not one of us that can't exist outside of that, except for those people who somehow manage to go off grid, you know, and do it themselves. So we're all stuck in that. And I'm not somebody strong enough, physically speaking. I can't go out and do a homestead and, you know, become self-sufficient and so on. But I am seeing very strong evidence that I am no longer going to require a central bank to issue me money to be able to partake in doing business with other people.
Right.
And I think that's great. I think that's a wonderful time to be alive, to see it all happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to be a witness to that. Absolutely. Yeah. That's great.
You know, if anybody gets the wrong idea, you don't have to be a Christian or anything. I'm not saying to people, hey,
right.
You know, the truth is in the Bible. Then.
Right.
These are ancient old. I can pull out stuff from other religions that basically talk about the same sort of thing. You know, to me, this is just the nature of what I call the Saturn death cult culture and such. And, you know, it's that culture I want to see stopped. The love of money.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. But one thing I wanted to ask you, with Eyes Wide Shut, because I don't think we ever touched on it yet, but the ending, the very ending in the toy store. What is happening at the very end? Tell me.
In the toy store, well,
before they, okay, is she being kidnapped? Is she being taken? Are they giving her up, so to speak?
I mean, from memory and just looking at what, you know, Vigilant Citizen, you know, the thing that stands out to me is, of course, the type of toy that is there in the toy shop, both at the beginning and in the final scene, which is that tiger thing. You know, goes back to that whole sort of slave kitten thing. And of course, it's Kidman and her daughter. You know, it's that idea that the daughter is being groomed. Right. You know, to follow up into the end thing as well. There's a couple of older guys that you can see in the toy scene
who are at Ziegler's party.
Ziegler's party. That was a standout aspect that in, you know, revising for you know, talking about this and so on. It's very obvious that, you know, Kubrick is just, in some respects, this is actually one of his most nihilist type, you know, films in terms of this, because, you know, nothing changes. The game goes on, right, and such. You just either choose to be a part of it, or to be consumed by it, or, you know, or to reject it, you know, as such. And to me, it's very creepy that the kid is involved in the last scene, and so on, because it's very obvious that that's where the threat ultimately is aimed, is at the, you know, generation of kids being brought up and so on like that. But you know, this idea that this couple who have got, you know, major relationship problems and all this sort of stuff that they go through with all the, what's the word, temptations, you know, she's approached by at least a couple of blokes that she could have, or tells them of times that she could have had it and so on. He's all flirty with people, but doesn't seem to be able, you know, girls, but doesn't seem to be able to sort of move in that direction, while being at the same time still very much not estranged, but indifferent to his wife in terms of the physical side of things and so on like that. I just personally like the idea that Kubrick is telling us that no matter who you are in life, a couple, a family, there is this influence beyond your understanding, beyond your strata of your society and so on like that, that is dictating how we all live, how we all, you know, what we all get to do, what we all get to be involved in and so on. And it is a society that is based entirely upon the idea of you can play, but you can't tell. All right. You know, it's that almost mafia omerta type sort of thing. And if you play the game, you'll do well.
Right.
All right. But there's always a consequence. Somebody gets hurt, but don't worry about them. They're nobodies. And that's, I think that's what Kubrick is actually bringing home in the last scenes at a personal level.
Okay.
And it's a very disillusioning end to the film, because as the article sort of stated at the bottom from Vigilant Citizen, nothing changes. Our eyes are all wide shut still to what's going on. Nothing changes. You're sitting in a toy store, and you've got all of those symbols that have been all the way through the film. You've seen them in various aspects and so on. That tiger and so on. The star, the girl,
the pentagrams, the Barbie.
The dead girl is, she had the kitten, and the tiger. I can't remember what the scene was now with it and so on. But it's also very heavily influenced by what I call the Venus part of the Saturn trine sort of. You have the planet Saturn, planet Venus, and the planet Mars has been the greatest influences of mythology that would come down, those gods. And we all know that Venus was, the goddess of love, but could also turn and be very destructive, on you. That's why, Venus's beauty, but also becomes a Medusa-like head of snakes that strikes at you and causes all kinds of chaos and such like that. But nonetheless, the procreative strain of thinking in the mystery schools and so on follows through the Venus, Diana, the Aphrodite, type symbolism and so on. And the most glaring symbol used in the whole film is when they first go to a party at the mansion. You see a symbol that is so Saturnian, it even catches my breath when I see it. It is the star of Ishtar. It is the eight-pointed star. Yeah,
around the room.
It's not a pentagram. It's the eight-pointed star of Ishtar. And of course, we know that the eight-pointed star has found its way into our Anglo-American culture. It's there in the Union Jack. The flag of Great Britain is a great big eight-pointed star. It's, we see it in so many aspects of it. But the fact that this film seems to concentrate on that aspect of Saturnian mythology, the eight-pointed star of Ishtar, Venus, Aphrodite, these manifestations of the planet Venus in mythology, which have become the guiding idea behind the fertility cults. Why Easter went from being a Passover ceremony, a Passover festival, it's now Ishtar, Easter. And all right. And what's happened with that is that's why you've got bunnies and eggs as the symbols of Easter and so on, all right? Because it's all the fertility of the bunny. It's why Playboy magazine shows a bunny, as a symbol, because Playboy magazine is a construct of the whole Ishtar worship, the worship of the feminine form, but purely from the aesthetic point of view as a sex object, and so on, right? The idea that fertility is sex promiscuity, and so on, the right to sexual promiscuity, basically fuck like bunnies. Becomes the
Jesus,
the whole sort of idea, all right, that comes into it, rather than the solemn idea that sex is what happens between two people who are going to bring a new life into this world and have responsibility for that life. It becomes the currency of pleasure rather than the currency of further on. And I think Eyes Wide Shut, Kubrick had really started to hone in on it. As I say, for me, there's a great linking over the decades between Lolita and Eyes Wide Shut. I can see that Lolita, who disappears from a hospital room because she's kidnapped by Quilty, who, Humbert later on finds out, he loses her at the hospital when she gets sick and so on. And he knows a car has been following, but years later, he finds out that Quilty has kidnapped her. And the last thing you see in the film is, he goes off to, he's decided he's going to go and kill Quilty. And we only hear that Humbert, dies of an illness before his trial for the murder of Quilty. But, there you've got that connection. What happens to little girls who get kidnapped by guys who work in, elite industries like Hollywood, like banking, like...
or in Eyes Wide Shut, friends in the art business.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes, that's
man.
right. Yes, yes, yeah.
Yep.
And you know, he really, I think that has a lot to do because, you know, Kubrick's wife, she was an
Yes.
actress first,
Yes.
but she became
Yeah.
quite a, you know, she was an accomplished painter in
So
her own
many of
right.
her paintings are in that movie,
Are in there,
particularly in their home.
Yeah,
a lot of them.
and
Yeah,
you know, she would know how corrupt the art industry is. You know what happens to people, as I said before earlier when I was explaining to you, you know, what the rock stars of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the excesses, these guys were amateurs compared to the artists of the 1920s,
yeah,
1930s with their addictions and carry on. You know, it got to the point where one of their groupies, in my opinion, went and murdered a woman and displayed her corpse on a Los Angeles street as the ultimate meat sculpture, surrealist meat sculpture. You know, nothing remotely like that. Even G.G. Allen, probably the most, you know,
right.
degenerate guy who's ever existed, I don't think he even comes close to that kind of degeneracy, because there isn't murder in his, you know, in his career or something. So the art industry is full of people who are, you know, they are part of what I call the Saturn death culture. Surrealism loved to dismember women. Pop culture, Andy Warhol, his ideas around such that loved to bring women into manufactured, you know, motifs of manufactured, what's the word? I want to say sort of pop art, which is what he sort of created, but the idea that they're nothing more than, women are nothing more than a picture.
Right.
As such, you know what I mean? They're just simply art objects, which is another way of saying they're just simply sex objects and so on, all right? And, you know, I think correct me if I'm wrong, I'm struggling here, but there's also that connection into the high fashion industry, isn't there, in the film?
Yes, there is, because
fashion design and stuff like that.
Leon Vitali,
Yeah,
Kubrick's, his right-hand man, in the newspaper articles, they are talking about a fashion designer or someone big in the fashion industry. Leon Vitali is the name they used. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you remember, it wasn't very much long after this that Andrew Cunanan shot, you know, Giovanni Versace in Florida. Okay. You know, in terms of, you know, that connection to the fashion industry. The fashion industry, you know, is yet again, it's a place where recruitment, and this is what the Maxwell trial, you know, Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein is showing you. Because, you know, look at the guy who turned up dead as an associate. He was a model agency procurer. You know, he had his own modeling agency, and he winds up dead before he can be brought to trial. Yeah, the facileness of it, the whole thing driven by the idea of sex as ultimate pleasure as opposed to an act of procreation is, that's a message I personally get from Kubrick's films, that the Hollywood industry, the fashion industry, the music industry, you know, the entertainment industry has created that as a concept to the point that now whatever people have about the abortion side of things and so on, I think you're going too far when abortion just becomes another form of contraception. It's just something that, you know, you are taking 5 minutes of fun in terms of a quickie that is promoted by one film after another out of Hollywood, and being absolved of any responsibility from what might come out of that 5 minutes of fun, because you can now get rid of it. You can now kill it and so on. In ancient times, when we didn't have these overpopulation ideas, this idea that there's so many people around, who cares if you've got one or two more people in the world and so on, there was a time for many thousands of years where your children were your pension. All right, that's why you had children. And that's why many people had children in those days at a very young age, because the children would look after the parent rather than the government. And but with the advent of pensions in the last 100 years, well, now 120 years, with the advent of the social welfare state, the idea that sex is something that it's something to help you in later life by the procreation of children, and they themselves will, have it. So, the way it worked, the extended family, they had the child, the parents worked in the fields, the grandparents looked after the children, all right, while the parents of the child brought in the income or whatever it was for the family to survive. And then that just shifted up, to the next generation and so on. The kids grow up, they have kids, their kids now look after their parents and so on. This was the way society worked for thousands of years. But what has changed, it changed during Roman times. Whenever you get these civilizations that sort of solve the problem of survival, survival is no longer, can I get enough food, water, and be sheltered for tonight? So, survival just becomes, hey man, am I going to be able to pay my debt to this guy without him killing me for not doing it? When you're in that sort of level of society and such, you lose this understanding of what children mean to a society. And we've reached that stage where children have become they become an inconvenience to having a good time, and not to everybody, but the narrative is there, because why do you need children? You're going to get a pension from the government. I've never had kids, but I'm guaranteed a pension here in Britain.
Okay.
1,000 years ago, I had to have kids to have anybody be able to fetch me water when I could no longer walk to the well. This is how it worked.
Interesting. Different.
Yeah, it's
different.
You read about the problems we have in the world and the complaints we have. We have, some people call it first world, complaints, problems, and such like that. And these problems are so insignificant to somebody living in a third world context, or who had lived 500 years ago and such. They wouldn't even see it as problems.
Yeah, they would, like, sometimes it wouldn't even be something to, like, I know we're not picking an example, but sometimes it wouldn't even be anywhere near something that they would consider to be a problem or to be a concept even.
Yeah. Why are you worried about that?
Yeah, what are you talking? It's
and such. We've got to make sure we've got enough grain in the store so we can get through the winter. There's all that kind of stuff. We've reached an age when people say, what are you going to do if you don't have any food or water? Oh, I'll go down to the supermarket and buy some. All right. That kind of thinking has debased the whole concept of family. And, this idea that we're living in the world today, you will own nothing and you will be happy. The Marxist idea of getting rid of the family so that the children are brought up by the state, such and so. This is what they have been trying to accelerate towards. And, it's a downside of the internet. People can get lost in the internet, and that becomes their full relationship, measure, how they measure their relationships, social media, that kind of thing. But, but in time, it only takes a few shocks to your financial system or such to realize that the society that we live in is on the spindly stilts, supported by things that could crash at any moment. And when they crash, you are not going to be worried if you can log on today. You're going to be worried about other things. And when that thing happens, you'll come to realize the value of not only a family, but an extended family. I think Japan is the country that has the worst case of their culture being ripped apart by people who now live in the internet, have no relationship outside of it, in terms of these things. So, that is a downside. I'm optimistic on other levels, but, yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. That optimistic piece is, that's great. So.
Yeah. So your question about the end scene of Wide Shut, somehow we got onto medieval.
Yeah, no, like
families,
you know what? I'll do this real quick since I have it pulled up. I'm just going to share screen real quick. I'll just quickly. Can you hear that at all on your end?
Yeah, I can see that.
Can you hear it?
Can now, yeah.
So just watch. Like, there's the two men.
Yep.
And just look at it. So, all right, bye. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye, baby girl. by parents, and they're gone,
yes.
and she's gone.
Yeah.
And they don't acknowledge her. They don't look at her. It's just quick cuts, close cuts.
Yeah.
She's gone.
Yeah.
She's gone.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, that all falls into how you read the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
But
seems they were targeting a kid, ultimately becomes the victim.
And if
there's another part earlier on in that scene as well, where she stands by some boxes, and the boxes have written on them the magic circle.
Yes. There's a huge pile
that whole
of
occult magic circle sort of thing that Kubrick brings into it. But you're right. It's funny. It didn't come to mind.
And people look at that, or they might not even rewatch it, and they'll think of the theory and look, oh, it's ridiculous. It's like, watch the movie.
Yeah.
Like pay attention. Watch the movie. He's got so many other things that you haven't noticed. Like you're trying to, you know, the people puff out their stomach and, oh, that's ridiculous and that's stupid. What I say to that is, open your fucking eyes.
Yeah,
like,
well,
honestly.
And it's a scene that has no meaning unless you have noticed that these two guys are at the party at the beginning.
You need to exactly. There's so much. There's so much to it. Yeah.
And it just comes back down to these elites. A lot of their parties. I mean, what we see with the Epstein coming out, it's all procurement. So things here in England, we had a guy called Jimmy Savile. I think you guys heard about him. And so on
for
like
sure.
That.
Yeah.
You know a band called Status Quo?
Yeah,
sort of, you know, rock and rollers from the 60s and so on like that.
Yeah.
You know, British band, sort of in that sort of hard rock, not metal, but so on. I remember the Paolo Rossi, he's a footballer, Francis Rossi, the Status Quo guy, being asked about Jimmy Savile because they're all connected into Yorkshire and all this sort of stuff that sort of happened. And he said, yeah, if you fell foul of the Yorkshire mafia that ran the radios in those days, Savile being the number one, you didn't get your songs played. All right. And he didn't say it, but he said, and that's why nobody said anything at the time about Savile. But here's the thing about Savile that nobody wants to talk about. They like to jump into the fact that he was raping dead bodies of people in the hospitals, that he was involved in all kinds of other things. But Savile was an intimate of the royal family in the sense that he could go to Buckingham Palace and have dinner with the Queen. Had a falling out with, you know, the guy who died recently, the Duke of Edinburgh, Phil the Greek, the Queen's husband. All right, had a falling out with him. He also used to have dinner with the Thatchers at the time, you know, Prime Minister Thatcher and all that sort of stuff, who we now know hid the fact that there was a diplomat who was regularly raping young boys in his posts to third world countries. And she hid it because she used it as leverage over the Labour Party because he was a Labour guy, all right, in terms of the politics. She didn't do the right thing and report him to the police for investigation. She used it to put her own thing. And Savile was regularly having dinner with the Thatchers and so on like that, or whatever.
Reading this image too.
Yeah.
You know, she's fine.
They're making films about Savile now, and they're talking about all the heinous things that he did, and the molestation of young girls and so on, and all that kind of stuff. But do you know what is not coming out, which I think is a travesty, which they're still hiding? In my opinion, Savile was just simply enjoying the perks of being a procurer for the establishment. All right. Because he worked in the entertainment industry, which attracted young girls and things like that. We all know about Gary Glitter and the Carey On back in those days here in the British sort of scene. And same thing was happening, you know, with bands like Aerosmith and so on like that in the States. And, you know, you guys in Canada probably know a few stories about pop stars with, you know, ridiculously underaged groupies that they carried on. Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page, you know, had that girl, you know.
Led Zeppelin invented anal.
Exactly, all that, you know, with fish, I believe, or something. But the
eel,
you know, all of these things that come out of that, all right, that come out of that side of things, is that it serves the glamour of the entertainment industry, of the rock and roll world, of the art world, serves as a magnet for kids who can be procured into the higher elements of the establishment's illicit pedophilia predilections and so on. It's not only Jimmy Savile, but we had a couple of famous gangsters that ran London in the 60s called the Krays.
The Krays.
Twins. All right,
Yep.
You know about them?
I know about the Krays, absolutely, yeah.
Well, the word is now coming out, apart from the fact that I think it was Ronnie, indulged in a few homosexual rapes in his time and things like that. Their connection with a guy called Lord Bothwick, who also had connections back in with Savile and so on like that. The Krays were allowed to do what they got away with in terms of gangstership and so on, because they were acting as a procurement into the political establishment, House of Lords, that kind of thing. All right. There's one family in particular who were a hard case family coming out of London who've now written a book about it, where one of the guys said that he was at the point where he was literally going to murder Ronnie Kray. There, it be damned what happened, because he pulled a young 7-year-old or something that age boy onto his lap, who was this guy's nephew. Okay. And this guy said, I was just waiting. If he tried anything at that point, history would have been changed at that point. But he's come out and basically said, you don't know, the Krays were procurers. All right. They were involved in a lot of the stuff and getting rid of the inconvenient stuff and so on. All right. Savile was involved. Eyes Wide Shut shows you how the procurement system works. Yeah. In terms of that, it's not necessarily, let's go to some third world village and kidnap some 2-year-old or offer $500 to some desperate family for the kid. Yes, that happens, but it's also this other, and that is creepy what you showed there in that film. I'd forgotten about that, the way she walks out. And to be honest, I'll be honest, I hadn't noticed it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, exactly. Yeah. Kubrick's not going to just give it to us. So that's what people need to understand. That, I mean, I know there's a lot of people that, like, when they talk about Kubrick, they try to sound, or they sound like they think that they know Kubrick, and I'm not trying to sound like that in any way, but he's not gonna just give it to us.
No, that's
he's not.
There's no doubt about it.
We need to use our minds, and that's I think that's at least clear. And if you look at the scene before that, like, why is she crying? Like, she's crying because she knows that they have to give her up. And if you start putting that stuff together, you see the scenes with her and Helena and brushing her hair. She's grooming her, literally grooming her with the picture of the panda and the satanic stars and and once you start putting that together, you're like, oh, okay. And they all have red hair, and it's like, oh, okay, it all makes sense now. But if you don't put the time into that, then it's ridiculous, it's so stupid. And it's so easy just to say it's stupid and not look into it. But I mean,
I've always wondered for years now, after I had heard the accusations made, why, Tom Cruise, I understand it. Okay. He's an outsider in the Hollywood scene. Because he's a Scientology sort of thing and that and such. But Nicole Kidman, her father, has been heavily accused of some very, very serious government-sponsored stuff.
Yes, MK Ultra related stuff.
I've always wondered why Kubrick went that way.
Exactly. And then let's not forget the underlying story of his daughter went to be a Scientologist. So some people think, okay, and she cut him off, like wouldn't talk to him, I don't think. So people think, okay, maybe, like, was he doing this as a way to keep in contact with her? Was he doing this as a way to, stick a, mud in the eye of Scientology? What was going on? There's just so much, right? There's so much going on there. So.
And this thing, we've always got to be careful. We're not there. We're never
exactly
right eyewitness types and so on. But it's like the saying, we might not know the day or the hour, but we can certainly detect the season. And the advent of Hollywood in the 20th century as the single greatest procurement factory for the abuse of men and women, young girls, young boys, and so on like that. It's just unprecedented.
Absolutely. I think right now is a perfect time to cut it, because it seems like we're about to jump off another waterfall. So it's like, okay, let's just wait until next time. Let's try to save it till next time. I think that's a great place to cut it for now. I'm going to reach out so that we can connect again. I think I'd like to have you back real soon to literally just continue this conversation. I think there's a lot to go over, and I'm glad that you have the background and the knowledge and the understandings that you do, because I think we can get a lot of interesting topics and conversations pulled out of it. So thank you so much for coming again, Troy. Thank you so much for your time as well. I'm very gracious. Before you go though, please let my viewers know and my listeners know where they can find you, as well as some of your works. And if you're working on anything new right now, you have the floor, my friend.
Well, before I get to what I've done and whatever, I want to thank you for once again providing a platform. People like me don't get to do this unless people like you put it together. And for that, I thank you very much for, giving me this time to sort of chat about things on such a free-ranging style. I really, honestly had a great time talking.
This was a lot of fun, man.
Topics. Yeah,
absolutely.
Film is my thing, and
cool.
I've always loved talking about the greats there, and Kubrick is certainly up there amongst them. But if people want to get an insight to where I'm coming from, you've heard some pretty crazy stuff probably come out of my mouth throughout the interview and so on. My book is called Saturn Death Cult. It's available on Kindle on Amazon. There is a website called saturndeathcult.com that you can go and look at for free, and it gives basically the overall idea of the theories I'm putting forward in terms of the cosmology of the book and how it relates into the occult world and what's going on in the world today. But the book is also available for those on Amazon. And I have written a kind of a prequel. It's called The Purple Dawn of Creation, which looks more into a sort of speculative idea of what the world would have looked like before the advent of the golden age of Saturn as related to us in mythology. So that sort of, a lot of people find that part of it very interesting, what the world looked like in, 60,000 years ago, as opposed to what mainstream science tells us it is. So it's well worth having a look at that if you so wish. Otherwise, Saturn Death Cult, it's newly revised since I originally wrote it. A lot more information. I put a lot of work into giving a pictorial representation of what I talk about. So if you ever find yourself confused with the cosmology and that, I hope the pictures set you straight on what I'm trying to say on it, and hope that in reading it basically allows you to see the world with very different eyes when it comes to matters of the occult and the symbols that are used that you see, and also what you see in terms of our modern world and how it's influenced by these symbols and who's using them to what effect. That's my main purpose for the book, is to give you that kind of information, to look at the world from a different perspective to the one that has constantly been thrown at us through media for the last 150 years.
Right on. And I've gone through one of your books, the Saturn Death Cult book, a little bit around the time when we spoke the first time. And I enjoyed it. I thought there's a lot of interesting stuff. A lot of it is very new to me. So it's almost, I don't want to say intimidating, but it's just new stuff for me. So I can't say that I digested it all right away, but I definitely enjoyed it. And I'll agree, the photos that you give definitely help, and the diagrams and just your way of writing, I really do appreciate it. So I do recommend that you guys check out his stuff. And
it's purely an introduction, so that, and my hope is that once people go, they can then follow what suits them in terms of courses of inquiry. From that, but armed with a different appreciation of what mythology was and so on like that. And it takes away, in my opinion, a lot of the manipulative power that, high-end corporate elites have, government institutions and so on have these days with these symbols. So it's there for people to use as a stepping stone to other things that will be important to them.
Awesome. Good stuff. All right, Troy. Well, thank you again for your time. And it's always a pleasure. And we're definitely going to have you on soon. So be well, my friend. And awesome. Well, we'll share the pleasure. And
thank you very much.
And we'll talk soon. Thank you. And you're very welcome. And take care of yourself, my friend.
You too.
All right. Ciao.